Mysteries. They swirl around us like the mist over a quiet Russian forest at dawn, obscuring the precise beginnings of things. We stand today on the cusp of uncovering the long, winding tale of the Russian Empire, a story stretching back through centuries of vast landscapes, enduring peoples, and dramatic transformations. It's a history filled with characters whose names echo through the annals of time, and others whose stories have been all but swallowed by the Siberian snows. Their real names, those who truly understood them, perhaps those voices are lost to us now, like a whisper carried away on a winter wind, yet the tale itself remains, unfolding with a flexible rhythm, as if the narrator himself is weaving the very events he describes. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, perhaps share your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see how far these sleepy tales travel. Long before any empire could even dream of stretching its dominion across such an immense landmass, the vast plains and endless forests of what we now call Eastern Europe were home to a tapestry of diverse peoples, their lives interwoven with the rhythms of nature. Among these early inhabitants were the East Slavs, a group of nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes who, much like snowflakes drifting across a balalaika tune, slowly spread across the land. They weren't a unified people in the modern sense, but rather a collection of related communities, each with its own customs and traditions, yet bound by a shared linguistic root and a common, often challenging existence. Their world was one of dense forests, wide rivers, and unforgiving winters, a landscape that shaped their resilience and resourcefulness. Imagine, if you will, small clusters of wooden dwellings, smoke curling lazily from their roofs into the crisp air, surrounded by the silent, watchful trees. They lived off the land, hunting, fishing, and cultivating what few crops the harsh climate allowed, their lives a perpetual dance with the seasons. These early Slavic tribes often found themselves in contact, and sometimes conflict, with various other groups. From the north, the fierce Varangians, often identified as Norsemen or Vikings, sometimes sailed down the great rivers, drawn by the promise of trade or plunder. From the south, nomadic peoples, like the Khazars and Pechenegs, swept across the steppes, their horsemen a formidable and often terrifying presence. The Slavs, while numerous, lacked a centralized political structure, making them susceptible to the influence and occasional dominance of these more organized groups. It was a time of fluid borders, shifting allegiances, and the constant ebb and flow of peoples across the land. One might even say it was a bit like trying to herd cats, except the cats were heavily armed and rode ponies. But in this dynamic environment, a subtle transformation began to occur. Some Slavic settlements grew larger, evolving into small towns that served as centers for trade and defense. These nascent urban centers, often strategically located along rivers, became vital hubs, drawing in goods and people from the surrounding countryside. Over time, certain tribal unions began to form, driven by the need for mutual protection or the ambition of powerful local leaders. These early political entities were far from the sophisticated states that would later emerge, but they represented a crucial step towards greater organization. Think of them as very, very early versions of a neighborhood watch, but with more axes and less fluorescent lighting. The East Slavs were slowly, almost imperceptibly, laying the groundwork for something far grander. They were learning the difficult art of cooperation, of shared defense, and of establishing rudimentary systems of governance. Their spiritual beliefs were deeply rooted in animism, with deities tied to nature, the forest spirit, the river god, the sun, and the thunder. These beliefs permeated their daily lives, offering explanations for the mysteries of their world and guiding their interactions with the formidable natural forces around them. Their folklore, rich with tales of mythical beasts and heroic figures, reflected their intimate connection to the land. The Dnieper River, a majestic artery flowing south towards the Black Sea, played a particularly significant role in these developments. It served not only as a vital trade route, connecting the Slavic lands to the Byzantine Empire in the south and Scandinavia in the north, but also as a conduit for cultural exchange. Along its banks, settlements like Kiev began to grow, benefiting from the constant flow of goods and ideas. This river was the superhighway of its day, except without the endless road construction. Through this watery pathway, influences from distant lands seeped into the Slavic heartland, subtly altering their customs and expanding their horizons. It was a slow process, almost imperceptible at first, but with each passing generation, the foundations of a more complex society were being laid. This gradual evolution, from scattered tribes to more cohesive proto-states, was a testament to the resilience and adaptability of the East Slavs, a testament to their quiet perseverance in a challenging world. It was a period of slow but steady growth, like a seed quietly germinating beneath the snow, preparing for the eventual bloom of a powerful state. Historians still argue whether these early Slavic settlements were primarily agrarian communities, or if trade routes played an equally, if not more, significant role in their initial development and consolidation. Regardless, the groundwork was being meticulously laid for the future emergence of something far greater. From these disparate beginnings, a new, more unified entity began to coalesce, like disparate threads slowly being woven into a robust tapestry. This was Kievan Rus, a political and cultural entity that emerged in the 9th century, marking a pivotal moment in the history of the East Slavs and laying the foundational stones for what would eventually become the Russian Empire. Its rise was closely intertwined with the arrival of the Varangians, those adventurous Norsemen who, unlike some of their more aggressive kin, often came not just to raid but to trade, and sometimes to rule. Legend has it, and indeed, many early chronicles suggest, that a group of Varangian chieftains, led by a figure named Rurik, were invited by the squabbling Slavic tribes to bring order and governance to their lands. It's a bit like calling in a consultant, but instead of PowerPoint presentations, you get longships and battle axes. Rurik is traditionally credited with establishing the first ruling dynasty in Novgorod, a significant northern trading hub. From there, his successors, most notably Oleg, expanded their influence southward, eventually seizing Kiev, or Kiev, which then stood as a vital strategic point on the Dnieper River. This capture of Kiev in the late 9th century is often seen as the true birth of Kievan Rus, making it the primary political and cultural center. The Dnieper, remember, was that ancient superhighway, and controlling Kiev meant controlling a large part of the lucrative trade route connecting Scandinavia to the prosperous Byzantine Empire. This control over trade brought wealth and power, allowing the nascent state to grow and consolidate its authority over a vast territory inhabited by numerous Slavic tribes. It wasn't quite an empire yet, but it was certainly a force to be reckoned with. The early rulers of Kievan Rus were a pragmatic bunch, adept at both warfare and diplomacy. They forged alliances, collected tribute from subjugated tribes, and engaged in brisk trade, particularly with the Byzantine Empire, which was at the time the unchallenged beacon of civilization and wealth in the region. The Byzantines offered not only exotic goods, but also cultural and religious influences that would profoundly shape the future of Rus. While the early Varangian rulers maintained their Norse traditions, they gradually assimilated into the Slavic culture, adopting their language and customs. This process of assimilation was quite remarkable, demonstrating the flexibility of both cultures, a slow melding that formed a distinct new identity. Perhaps the most transformative event in the early history of Kievan Rus was the adoption of Orthodox Christianity. This momentous decision occurred under Prince Vladimir the Great in 988 CE. The story, as it's often told, is that Vladimir explored various religions: Islam, Judaism, Roman Catholicism, and Eastern Orthodoxy, before making his choice. He supposedly sent envoys to observe the religious practices of neighboring lands, and their report from Constantinople, detailing the awe-inspiring beauty of Hagia Sophia, allegedly sealed the deal. One can almost hear them saying, well, the mosaics were truly spectacular, and the incense was just divine. Whether driven by spiritual conviction, political calculation, or a mix of both, Vladimir's conversion was a strategic masterstroke. It not only provided a unifying spiritual framework for the diverse peoples of Rus, but also firmly placed them within the sphere of Byzantine culture, connecting them to a rich tradition of art, architecture, law, and literature. The mass baptism of the Kievans in the Dnieper River marked a new era. Churches began to rise across the land, monasteries became centers of learning and culture, and the Cyrillic alphabet, adapted from Greek, was introduced, facilitating the translation of religious texts and the development of a written Slavic language. This period is often considered the Golden Age of Kievan Rus. Under rulers like Yaroslav the Wise, Vladimir's son, the state reached its zenith. Yaroslav oversaw the codification of laws, the construction of magnificent cathedrals, and the flourishing of education and scholarship. Kiev itself became a grand European capital, adorned with golden-domed churches and bustling markets, a vibrant hub of intellectual and economic activity. Imagine strolling through its streets, the aroma of spices wafting from merchant stalls, the murmur of different languages in the air, and the solemn chanting from a nearby cathedral, a truly sensory experience. However, even in its golden age, the seeds of future fragmentation were being sown. The succession system, based on a complex princely rotation, often led to internecine squabbles and civil wars among the Rurikid princes. Each prince sought to expand his own domain, creating a patchwork of semi-independent principalities, loosely bound by allegiance to the Grand Prince of Kiev. This decentralized structure, while allowing for regional development, also created inherent vulnerabilities. It meant that while Kiev might have been the titular head, real power was often dispersed, making it harder to mount a unified defense against external threats. Historians still argue whether the dynastic struggles among the Rurikid princes were the primary cause of Kievan Rus's eventual decline, or if external pressures played a more significant role in its weakening. This internal jostling for power, a perennial human pastime, would ultimately pave the way for a darker chapter in the history of these lands, as an immense storm was gathering on the distant steppes, unseen and unimaginable to most. The golden age of Kievan Rus, vibrant and culturally rich as it was, held within it the fragile seeds of its own undoing. Seeds that would unfortunately blossom into a period of profound upheaval and darkness. The internal squabbles among the Rurikid princes, though often contained, gradually weakened the fabric of the state, making it less resilient to the immense external shock that was about to arrive. This cataclysmic event, known in history as the Mongol Yoke, would forever alter the trajectory of Russian development, leaving an indelible mark on its identity and future. Imagine, if you will, the serene landscape of Kievan Rus, a quiet evening, perhaps the sound of a balalaika softly playing, suddenly shattered by the distant rumble of 1,000 hooves, growing louder and louder until it became an earth-shaking thunder. From the vast, windswept steppes of Asia, a force unlike anything seen before was sweeping westward. The Mongol hordes, united and led by the formidable Genghis Khan, and after his death, by his equally ambitious successors. Their military machine was a marvel of organization and terrifying efficiency, characterized by lightning-fast cavalry, disciplined tactics, and an unwavering determination. They were, to put it mildly, not in the mood for tea and polite conversation. Their initial forays into the Rus lands began in the early 13th century with scouting parties and skirmishes that hinted at the storm to come. The Rus's princes, accustomed to their own localized conflicts, failed to recognize the sheer scale and destructive potential of this new enemy. They were fragmented, unable to unite effectively, even in the face of such an existential threat, each principality often prioritizing its own immediate interests over the collective defense. It was a classic case of too many cooks spoiling the broth, and in this instance, the broth was quite literally their civilization. The full weight of the Mongol invasion descended upon Rus in 1237, led by Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan. One by one, the major cities and principalities fell. Ryazan was razed, Vladimir burned, and then in 1240, the grand capital of Kiev itself was besieged and utterly destroyed. The descriptions from contemporary chronicles speak of unimaginable devastation. Grand cathedrals reduced to rubble, entire populations massacred or enslaved, and the once thriving urban centers transformed into ghostly ruins. It was a brutal, relentless conquest that left a scar on the land and the collective memory of the Rus people. The sheer ferocity of the Mongol assault, combined with the fragmented nature of Rus's defense, meant that resistance, while often valiant, was ultimately futile. For the next 2.5 centuries, much of the Rus's lands existed under the direct or indirect rule of the Golden Horde, the westernmost part of the Mongol Empire. This period is known as the Mongol Yoke, a term that vividly conveys the oppressive nature of their dominion. It wasn't a direct occupation in the sense of Mongol administrators residing in every town, but rather a system of vassalage. The Rus's princes were allowed to retain their local authority, but only under the strict overlordship of the Khan. They were required to pay heavy tribute, vast sums of money, furs, and other goods to the Golden Horde, a constant drain on their resources and a source of immense hardship for the common people. Furthermore, the princes had to travel to the Horde's capital, Sarai, on the Volga River to receive their yarlik, or patent of office, from the Khan. This journey was often perilous and humiliating, a stark reminder of their subjugated status. The long period of Mongol rule had profound and complex consequences for the Rus lands. On one hand, it isolated Rus from the burgeoning cultural and technological developments taking place in Western Europe, deepening the divide between East and West. While Western Europe was experiencing the Renaissance and the early stirrings of scientific inquiry, Rus was locked in a struggle for survival and enduring the burdens of tribute. It also led to a significant population decline and the widespread destruction of infrastructure. On the other hand, some historians argue that the Mongols inadvertently contributed to the eventual rise of Moscow. The Mongol overlords, in their quest for efficient tribute collection, often favored certain princes who proved most loyal and effective in gathering taxes from their subjects. These favored princes, often from Moscow, were granted greater authority and allowed to expand their territories, often at the expense of their less fortunate rivals. The Mongol Yoke also influenced the development of the Muscovite state's political culture, fostering a more autocratic and centralized style of governance. The absolute power of the Khan, to whom the Rus's princes bowed, likely served as a model for the future Russian autocracy. The notion of a strong, centralized ruler holding sway over a vast domain gained traction during this period. The constant need to raise tribute and maintain order for the Mongols may have inadvertently taught the Muscovite princes valuable lessons in administration and control. It was a harsh school, to be sure, but one that instilled a particular kind of discipline and ambition. This period also saw the rise of the Orthodox Church as a powerful unifying force among the fragmented Rus's people. The Mongols, being largely religiously tolerant themselves, did not persecute the Orthodox Church. In fact, they often granted it special exemptions from taxation. As a result, the church became a repository of Rus's identity and culture, providing solace and continuity in a time of great suffering. It was a bit like a cultural beacon in a very, very dark night. While the Mongol Yoke was undoubtedly a period of immense suffering and stagnation, it also ironically contributed to the political landscape that would eventually give rise to the future Russian state. The fragmentation of Kievan Rus into numerous smaller principalities was deepened by the Mongol conquest, but within this fractured landscape, a new power was slowly and strategically beginning to gather strength, quietly learning the harsh lessons of survival and dominance under the watchful, if distant, eye of the Golden Horde. The stage was being set for a new chapter, one that would see a particular city rise from the ashes of devastation to claim leadership. Historians still argue whether the lasting influence of the Mongol Yoke on Russian political development was primarily a negative force, fostering authoritarianism, or if it inadvertently provided the conditions for the eventual unification under Moscow. From the ashes of the Mongol devastation, amidst the scattered remnants of what was once Kievan Rus, a new center of power began its slow, deliberate ascent, much like a sapling pushing through cracked earth after a forest fire. This was Moscow, a principality that initially seemed rather unremarkable compared to its older, grander brethren like Vladimir or Tver. Yet Moscow possessed a unique combination of geographic advantages, shrewd leadership, and a dash of good fortune that would ultimately propel it to prominence, gathering the disparate Rus lands under its burgeoning wing. Moscow's initial appeal was rather subtle. It was situated somewhat off the main routes of the Mongol invasions, offering a relative haven from the constant raiding that plagued other principalities. Think of it as being just far enough off the beaten path that the Mongol cavalry might decide to stop for a quick nap before getting to you. Its location at the confluence of several rivers also provided natural defensive barriers and, crucially, access to various trade routes, allowing it to gradually accumulate wealth. Unlike the bustling, exposed cities along the Dnieper, Moscow was nestled within dense forests, providing a natural protective barrier that other principalities lacked. This wasn't a glamorous advantage, perhaps, but in a chaotic world, quiet security was a commodity worth its weight in gold, or rather, in furs. The princes of Moscow, members of the Rurikid dynasty, were remarkably adept at navigating the treacherous political landscape of the Mongol Yoke. They adopted a strategy of pragmatic cooperation with their Mongol overlords, a stark contrast to the more defiant and often ultimately ruinous stances taken by other princes. While other Rus principalities occasionally attempted to resist Mongol authority, often resulting in brutal punitive expeditions, Moscow consistently paid its tribute promptly and reliably. This wasn't exactly heroic, but it was effective. They became the Mongols' preferred tax collectors, often entrusted with gathering tribute from other Rus' lands. This role, while seemingly subservient, granted them immense leverage. It allowed them to assess the wealth of their neighbors, build relationships with local elites, and most importantly, accumulate a portion of the collected tribute for themselves. It was a rather ingenious, if slightly uncomfortable, business model. This strategy of cooperation allowed Moscow to grow both economically and politically. While other principalities were being drained by Mongol demands and internal conflicts, Moscow was steadily accumulating resources and expanding its territory, often by purchasing lands or inheriting them through strategic marriages. The princes of Moscow also proved adept at playing off rivalries among other Rus' princes, skillfully exploiting their feuds to their own advantage. They were masters of the long game, patiently building their influence, brick by painful brick. One might even say they were the original slow and steady winners of the medieval race. A crucial factor in Moscow's rise was its close alliance with the Russian Orthodox Church. As mentioned before, the Church had emerged as a powerful symbol of Rus' identity during the Mongol Yoke. The metropolitans, the heads of the Russian Orthodox Church, gradually relocated their seat to Moscow. This relocation, driven by a combination of political expediency and the relative safety Moscow offered, conferred immense spiritual prestige upon the principality. Moscow became seen not just as a political center, but as the spiritual heart of the Rus' lands, the Third Rome, inheriting the mantle of Constantinople after its fall. This religious endorsement provided a powerful ideological justification for Moscow's growing authority, appealing to the deep-seated faith of the common people. The Muscovite princes also understood the importance of accumulating land and titles. They skillfully absorbed weaker principalities, either through peaceful means or through strategic military campaigns. They consistently championed the idea of unifying all Rus' lands, presenting themselves as the legitimate inheritors of the Kievan Rus' legacy and the natural leaders for a new, unified state. This narrative resonated deeply with a people weary of fragmentation and foreign domination. The gradual expansion of Muscovite territory created a burgeoning state, a physical manifestation of their growing power and ambition. Notable figures like Ivan the Sirs on Kalatas, whose nickname Moneybag suggests his financial acumen, played a significant role in this early consolidation. He was particularly skilled at leveraging his relationship with the Golden Horde to Moscow's benefit, further increasing its wealth and influence. His successor, Dmitry Donskoy, took a bolder step, famously leading a united Rus' army to victory against the Mongols at the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380. While this victory did not immediately end the Mongol Yoke, it would be many more decades before complete liberation. It was a symbolically monumental event. It demonstrated that the Mongols were not invincible, and more importantly, that a united Rus' could indeed stand against them. This battle became a powerful rallying cry, cementing Moscow's image as the primary defender of Rus lands and the harbinger of future liberation. It was a morale booster, to say the least, after centuries of feeling like the underdogs. This period of Moscow's rise was not without its challenges. There were still internal feuds, occasional Mongol raids, and periods of severe famine and plague. Yet, through it all, the Muscovite princes maintained their vision, their strategic patience, and their unwavering determination to centralize power. They cultivated a sense of national identity that transcended local loyalties, laying the psychological groundwork for a unified Russian state. The subtle yet persistent expansion of their territory, the accumulation of wealth, the invaluable support of the church, and their pragmatic approach to the Mongol overlords all combined to make Moscow the undeniable frontrunner in the race to rebuild a fractured land. Historians still argue about the precise moment when Moscow truly surpassed its rivals in power and influence. But by the late 14th century, its trajectory was clearly pointing towards dominance, a quiet but relentless force gathering strength in the heart of the forest. With Moscow firmly established as the ascendant power, the stage was set for the culmination of centuries of slow, painstaking consolidation. The time had come for the formal shedding of the Mongol Yoke and the gathering of the remaining disparate Rus lands under a single, powerful sovereign. This monumental task fell to Ivan III, often known as Ivan the Great, a ruler whose reign, from 1462 to 1505, is regarded as the foundational period of the centralized Russian state and the true birth of the Tsardom. His reign was a deliberate and calculating march towards absolute power, a grand tapestry woven with threads of diplomacy, strategic marriages, and, when necessary, decisive military action. Ivan III inherited a principality that was already strong, but he possessed the vision and political acumen to transform it into something far grander. He understood that the time was ripe to finally cast off the shackles of Mongol overlordship, which by his time had significantly weakened. The Golden Horde itself was fractured, beset by internal conflicts and the emergence of rival khanates. This internal disarray within the Mongol ranks presented Ivan with a golden opportunity, one he seized with remarkable precision. The moment was ripe, like a ripe berry ready to be plucked from the vine. His most symbolic act of defiance against the Mongols occurred in 1480 during the Great Stand on the Ugra River. The Khan of the Golden Horde, Akhmat, marched his forces to confront Ivan, expecting the usual show of deference and tribute. However, Ivan, instead of submitting, gathered a large army and took up a defensive position on the opposite bank of the Ugra. For weeks, the two armies faced each other across the river, locked in a tense standoff. Neither side dared to attack. As autumn turned to winter and the first snow began to fall like soft whispers from the heavens, the Mongol forces, perhaps due to dwindling supplies or internal dissent, simply turned around and retreated. It was less a battle and more a prolonged staring contest, but its outcome was profound. The Mongol Yoke was effectively over. Russia was finally free after more than 2 centuries of foreign domination. It was a victory not won with bloodshed, but with strategic patience and a touch of psychological warfare, proving sometimes the best way to win is simply to show up and wait for the other side to get bored. With the Mongol threat largely neutralized, Ivan turned his attention to expanding Moscow's dominion and completing the unification of the Rus' lands. He was a master of diplomacy and subterfuge, often employing a mix of promises, threats, and outright coercion to bring independent principalities under Moscow's control. The powerful city-state of Novgorod, a vibrant commercial republic with strong Western ties, was a particular target. Novgorod possessed immense wealth and a proud tradition of self-governance, making it a formidable challenge. Ivan skillfully exploited internal divisions within Novgorod, eventually subduing it through military force in 1478. He famously carried off the Vech Bell, the symbol of Novgorod's independent assembly, to Moscow, signifying the end of its republican freedoms and its complete absorption into the Muscovite state. It was a clear message. Autonomy was out. Centralization was in. Ivan's territorial expansion was relentless. He annexed Tver, Yaroslavl, Rostov, and other significant principalities, steadily building a vast, consolidated state. His vision was to gather all the historically Rus lands, including those under Lithuanian rule, though this ambition would take centuries to fully realize. He also recognized the symbolic importance of his new position. In 1472, he married Sophia Palaiologina, a niece of the last Byzantine emperor. This marriage was more than just a union of two people. It was a powerful statement. It allowed Ivan to claim spiritual succession to the Byzantine Empire, which had fallen to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. He adopted the double-headed eagle as the state emblem, a direct symbol of Byzantine imperial authority, and began to refer to Moscow as the Third Rome, the true heir to Rome and Constantinople as the center of Orthodox Christianity. This ideological claim provided a powerful religious and historical justification for his autocratic rule and Russia's destiny as a great power. Under Ivan III, the administrative structure of the nascent Russian state began to take shape. He introduced elements of Byzantine court ceremony and established the foundations of a centralized bureaucracy. Legal codes were developed, and the concept of the sovereign's absolute authority over his subjects was increasingly enforced. He invited foreign architects and craftsmen, particularly from Italy, to Moscow, who helped construct the magnificent red brick walls and towers of the Kremlin, as well as the beautiful Dormition Cathedral, which became the coronation church for Russian monarchs. These architectural marvels were not just buildings, they were physical manifestations of Moscow's growing power and imperial aspirations, designed to awe both subjects and foreign envoys alike. Ivan's reign marked a decisive break from the fragmented feudalism of earlier Russia's history. He laid the groundwork for the autocratic system that would characterize Russian rule for centuries to come. His policies fostered a strong sense of unity and national purpose, essential for the arduous task of state building in a vast and diverse land. While he was a stern and sometimes ruthless ruler, his strategic brilliance and unwavering commitment to unification transformed Moscow from a regional power into the nucleus of a nascent empire. He solidified the concept of a single, powerful sovereign, a concept that would be inherited and expanded upon by his formidable grandson, the man who would truly earn the moniker of Terrible. The transition from scattered principalities to a unified Russian state under Ivan the Great was a pivotal moment, shaping the course of history for centuries to come, laying the very bedrock upon which the future empire would rise, like the solid foundation of a grand, if sometimes imposing, palace. Following the foundational work of Ivan the Great, the consolidated Russian state, now truly a tsardom in all but official title, was poised for further expansion and centralization. This next tumultuous chapter belongs to his grandson, Ivan IV, a figure who remains one of the most enigmatic and indeed terrifying rulers in Russian history, famously known as Ivan the Terrible. His reign, spanning from 1533 to 1584, was a complex blend of brilliant reforms, ruthless political maneuvering, and periods of extreme paranoia and brutality that earned him his fearsome moniker. It was a time when the very soul of Russia seemed to swing wildly between enlightenment and sheer darkness, much like a pendulum caught in a violent storm. Ivan IV came to the throne as a young child, and his early years were marred by infighting among powerful boyar, noble factions vying for control. This turbulent upbringing, filled with intrigue, betrayal, and a constant sense of vulnerability, deeply impacted his psychological development, perhaps contributing to the later extremes of his rule. When he finally asserted his full authority, he was determined to crush the power of the boyars, whom he saw as a threat to his absolute sovereignty, and whom he blamed for the chaos of his youth. In 1547, at the age of 16, he was crowned as the first Tsar of all Rus, a title derived from the Latin Caesar signifying his imperial ambitions and his claim to be the legitimate successor to the Roman and Byzantine emperors. This official adoption of the title marked a profound shift, elevating the ruler of Moscow from a grand prince to an emperor in his own right, a figure destined to command a vast and unified domain. Ivan's early reign was characterized by a period of significant reform, often referred to as the Chosen Council period, during which he enacted a series of progressive changes with the help of trusted advisors. He convened the first Zemsky Sobor, Assembly of the Land, a sort of national parliament, albeit one with limited power, bringing together representatives from various social classes to discuss important state matters. He initiated legal reforms, culminating in the Sudebnik of 1550, a revised law code that aimed to standardize legal procedures and curb the corruption of local officials. Military reforms were also undertaken, reorganizing the army and introducing the streltsy, a new corps of musketeers who would serve as a professional standing army. These reforms demonstrated Ivan's early vision for a stronger, more efficient, and centralized state, a ruler genuinely concerned with improving the governance of his expanding realm. One might say he started off with all the best intentions, like someone meticulously organizing their sock drawer before realizing they prefer chaos. Territorial expansion continued under Ivan IV, with significant victories that further solidified Russia's position as a major power. In 1552, he achieved a monumental triumph by conquering the Khanate of Kazan, a powerful successor state to the Golden Horde located on the Volga River. This victory not only removed a long-standing threat from Russia's eastern flank, but also opened up the Volga for Russian trade and colonization. 4 years later, he annexed the Khanate of Astrakhan, gaining full control of the entire Volga River and establishing a direct route to the Caspian Sea. These conquests were crucial for Russia's security and economic development, securing vital trade routes and expanding its reach towards Asia. These territorial gains were not merely about land, they were about integrating diverse peoples and resources into the burgeoning empire. However, the latter half of Ivan's reign descended into a period of increasing paranoia, mental instability, and extreme cruelty, earning him the terrible moniker. This shift is often attributed to the death of his beloved first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, in 1560, which he suspected was due to poisoning by the boyars. His distrust of the nobility escalated into a full-blown reign of terror known as the Oprichnina, 1565-1572. During this period, Ivan divided the country into two parts: the Zemshchina, governed by the traditional boyar council, and the Oprichnina, his personal domain, governed by him with absolute authority. He established the Oprichniki, a brutal, black-clad force who ruthlessly suppressed perceived traitors, seizing their lands, executing entire families, and devastating entire regions. The Oprichnina was a tool of terror designed to break the power of the old aristocracy and consolidate the Tsar's absolute power. Cities like Novgorod, suspected of disloyalty, suffered horrific massacres. Thousands of people, from prominent nobles to common peasants, were tortured and executed. The Oprichnina succeeded in crushing aristocratic opposition, but at a terrible cost. It devastated the Russian economy, depopulated vast areas, and created a climate of fear and suspicion that permeated every level of society. It was a bizarre and destructive experiment in social engineering, dismantling old structures with extreme prejudice. Historians still argue whether the oprichnina was a calculated, albeit brutal, political strategy, or simply the manifestation of Ivan's escalating madness. Despite the internal turmoil, Ivan continued to pursue foreign policy objectives, though with mixed results. He launched the protracted Livonian War, 1558-1583, to gain access to the Baltic Sea, a vital route for trade and European engagement. This war, however, proved to be a costly and ultimately unsuccessful endeavor, draining Russia's resources and manpower. It was a classic example of biting off more than you can chew, only in this case, the chewing involved a lot of very sharp swords. Ivan the Cavalry's reign ended in 1584, leaving behind a vastly expanded but deeply traumatized and economically depleted state. He had achieved his goal of absolute autocracy, but at a tremendous human cost. His legacy is one of stark contradictions. The visionary reformer who laid the groundwork for a centralized empire, and the tyrannical madman who unleashed unprecedented terror upon his own people. His death marked the end of the direct line of Rurikid rulers, and perhaps ironically, set the stage for a period of profound instability that would almost undo everything he had built, a time known as the Time of Troubles. The groundwork for the empire was indeed solid, but the next generation would face the tremors of his methods. The death of Ivan the Terrible in 1584 plunged Russia into a period of profound instability and chaos known as the Time of Troubles. This wasn't merely a political crisis, but a complete breakdown of order, a period when the very fabric of Russian society seemed to unravel, stretching from dynastic uncertainty to foreign invasion and widespread famine. It was as if the balalaika that had been playing a haunting but steady tune suddenly snapped its strings, leaving only discord and silence. This was far more than just a rough patch. It was an existential threat that nearly extinguished the nascent Russian state. The immediate cause of the Time of Troubles was the dynastic crisis that followed Ivan IV's death. In so he left behind two sons, Fyodor I, who was pious and weak-willed, and Dmitri, a young child. Fyodor, despite his gentle nature, was incapable of effectively ruling the vast and complex state his father had forged. The real power during his reign rested with his brother-in-law, Boris Godunov, a shrewd and ambitious boyar. When Tsarevich Dmitri mysteriously died in Uglitch in 1591, widely believed to have been an accident, suspicion inevitably fell upon Godunov, though historians still argue whether he was truly responsible. With Dmitri's death, the direct line of the Rurikid dynasty, which had ruled Ruses for over 7 centuries, came to an end. Upon Fyodor's death in 1598, Boris Godunov was elected Tsar by the Zemsky Sobor. While he was an able administrator who tried to implement reforms and strengthen the state, his reign was plagued by immense challenges. A series of devastating famines struck Russia from 1601 to 1603, causing widespread starvation and social unrest. This natural disaster, combined with the lingering suspicion about Dmitri's death and a general sense of unease following the end of the old dynasty, created fertile ground for discontent. The common people, already burdened by Ivan the Terrible's policies, saw these calamities as divine punishment and began to question Godunov's legitimacy. It was a perfect storm of bad luck and lingering distrust, a situation that no amount of good governance could easily fix. Into this vacuum of legitimate authority and widespread suffering stepped a series of false Dimitris, impostors claiming to be the miraculously escaped Tsarevich Dmitri. The first and most successful false Dmitri I appeared in Poland-Lithuania in 1604, gaining support from Polish magnates and the Pope. He was a charismatic figure, and with Polish backing, he marched into Russia, attracting a growing number of disgruntled peasants, Cossacks, and discontented nobles. He exploited the widespread belief that the true Dmitri was still alive, playing on the people's yearning for a legitimate ruler. When Boris Godunov suddenly died in 1605, false Dmitri I seized Moscow and was crowned Tsar. His reign, however, was short-lived and turbulent. He alienated the powerful boyars with his pro-Polish policies and perceived Western habits, and he failed to address the deep-seated grievances of the populace. He was eventually overthrown and killed in a boyar-led uprising in 1606, his body ignominiously burned and its ashes shot from a cannon towards Poland. This was certainly not how one typically ended a royal career. The period that followed was a dizzying succession of weak czars, including Vasily Shuisky, another boyar who seized power, and the appearance of false Dmitri II, known as the Thief of Tushino, who set up a rival court outside Moscow, further splintering the country. The civil war intensified, with various factions, including Cossacks, rebellious peasants, and the remnants of Dmitri's supporters, fighting for control. The country dissolved into anarchy, with widespread brigandage, lawlessness, and a complete breakdown of central authority. It was a time when might truly made right, and even that was questionable. The chaos also attracted foreign intervention. Poland-Lithuania, seeing Russia's weakness as an opportunity to expand its influence and territory, directly intervened. In 1610, Polish forces occupied Moscow, and the Polish king Sigismund III's son, Władysław I Wasa, was even offered the Russian throne by some boyar factions. Sweden also joined the fray, seizing northern territories and attempting to install its own candidate on the throne. Russia was on the verge of losing its independence, its vastness becoming a prize for ambitious foreign powers. The very idea of a unified Russian state seemed to be fading into legend. The sheer scale of the crisis, the fear of losing their Orthodox faith and national identity under foreign Catholic or Protestant rule, finally spurred a collective patriotic uprising among the Russian people. The call for national unity resonated deeply, particularly within the Orthodox Church. In 1612, a powerful national militia led by Kuzma Minin, a merchant from Nizhny Novgorod, and Prince Dmitry Pozharsky, a military leader, marched on Moscow. This volunteer army, united by a common desire to expel the foreign invaders and restore order, ultimately succeeded in liberating Moscow from Polish occupation. It was a truly remarkable display of national resilience, a testament to the enduring spirit of the Russian people when faced with ultimate adversity. The story sank into legend, the triumph of the common man over seemingly insurmountable odds. The liberation of Moscow marked the turning point, signaling the beginning of the end for the time of troubles. With the capital secured and foreign invaders largely expelled, the immediate task was to elect a new czar and restore legitimate dynastic rule. This tumultuous period, which lasted from 1598 to 1613, left Russia utterly devastated. The population had plummeted, vast areas of agricultural land lay fallow, and trade routes were disrupted. Yet ironically, it also forged a stronger sense of national identity and a deeper yearning for a strong, centralized government that could prevent such chaos from ever recurring. The painful lessons learned during the time of troubles would profoundly influence the subsequent development of the Russian autocracy, reinforcing the belief that only an absolute monarch could guarantee stability and order in such a vast and often volatile land. Historians still argue whether the time of troubles was primarily a dynastic crisis, a social revolt, or a foreign invasion, but its cumulative impact was undeniably the closest Russia ever came to complete collapse before the 20th century. With the foreign invaders expelled and the chaotic storm of the time of troubles finally subsiding, the exhausted Russian land collectively yearned for stability and legitimate rule. The imperative was clear. A new czar had to be chosen to restore order and rebuild the shattered state. This crucial decision fell to the Zemsky Sobor, the Assembly of the Land, which convened in 1613. After much deliberation and political maneuvering, a young, unassuming, and relatively uncontroversial candidate was chosen, Mikhail Fyodorovich Romanov. His election marked the beginning of a new chapter in Russian history, inaugurating the Romanov Dynasty, which would rule Russia for over 3 centuries, from 1613 until the Revolution of 1917. The future of the Russian Empire, though yet to fully emerge, now had a new, albeit shaky, foundation. Mikhail Romanov was a distant relative of Ivan the Terrible's first wife, Anastasia Romanovna. Crucially, his father, Patriarch Filaret, was a highly respected religious leader who had been imprisoned by the Poles during the time of troubles. This connection to the old dynasty, combined with his youth, he was only 16 at the time of his election, and perceived lack of political ambition, made him an appealing compromise candidate. He was seen as a figure who could unite the warring factions and bring peace, rather than exacerbate existing tensions. It was a bit like choosing the quietest kid in the class to be the group leader, hoping they wouldn't rock the boat too much. His selection was not based on overwhelming charisma or military prowess, but on the desperate need for a unifying figure and a return to some semblance of dynastic legitimacy. The early years of Mikhail Romanov's reign were naturally focused on the arduous task of reconstruction and stabilization. The country was devastated, its economy in ruins, and its population significantly reduced by famine, war, and disease. The new government faced widespread lawlessness, with banditry rampant in many regions. Slowly but surely, order was reestablished. The government worked to suppress remaining pockets of resistance and foreign incursions, negotiate peace treaties with Sweden and Poland-Lithuania, though some territorial losses were sustained, and revive the shattered economy. This was a monumental undertaking, akin to rebuilding a house after a tornado, brick by painful brick. A key figure in this period of restoration was Mikhail's father, Patriarch Filaret. Upon his release from Polish captivity in 1619, he effectively became the co-ruler of Russia, holding the title of Great Sovereign alongside his son until his death in 1633. Filaret was a strong and experienced leader who provided much-needed guidance and administrative acumen to the young Tsar. His authority, both spiritual and temporal, was instrumental in reasserting central control and rebuilding the state apparatus. This father-son duo provided a stable leadership during a critical transitional phase, helping to mend the fractured nation. The initial Romanov Tsars, including Mikhail and his successor, Alexei the Birch, embarked on a gradual but consistent path of centralization and strengthening of autocratic power. The Zemsky Sobor, which had played such a crucial role in electing Mikhail, gradually lost its influence. As the dynasty became more secure, the need for broad public consultation diminished, and the Tsar's authority grew increasingly absolute. This was a deliberate policy to prevent another time of troubles, reinforcing the conviction that a strong, unquestionable monarch was the only guarantor of stability. Territorial expansion also continued, albeit often through a less dramatic and more incremental process than under Ivan the Terrible. The most significant direction of expansion during the 17th century was eastward, across the vast and sparsely populated lands of Siberia. Russian explorers, Cossacks, and fur traders pushed relentlessly across the Urals, driven by the lure of valuable furs, particularly sable, a seemingly endless resource. These expeditions were often privately funded and operated with little direct government oversight initially, but the state quickly followed, building forts and establishing administrative centers. This expansion was remarkably swift, covering immense distances, though often at a slow, calm rhythm, like the quiet flow of a Siberian river. By the mid-17th century, Russian pioneers had reached the Pacific Ocean, laying claim to a vast new frontier. This was a different kind of conquest, one less about military campaigns against established states and more about gradual penetration and assimilation of indigenous peoples. Internally, the 17th century saw important developments in the legal and social structure of Russia. In 1649, the Ulozhenie, a comprehensive new law code, was adopted. This code consolidated existing laws, codified the legal status of various social groups, and crucially, formally cemented the system of serfdom. Peasants were definitively tied to the land, their freedom of movement restricted, effectively binding them to their landlords. This measure, while providing a degree of social stability and ensuring a labor force for the nobility and the state, also created deep-seated grievances that would simmer for centuries and have profound consequences for future Russian society. It was a bit like putting a very large, very heavy lid on a boiling pot, hoping it wouldn't eventually explode. The mid-17th century also witnessed a significant event within the Russian Orthodox Church, the schism, Raskol. Under Patriarch Nikon, reforms were introduced to bring Russian Orthodox liturgical practices in line with those of the Greek Orthodox Church. These reforms, seemingly minor to an outsider, sparked a furious backlash from traditionalists who saw them as a betrayal of the true faith and a submission to foreign influence. The Old Believers, as the traditionalists became known, refused to accept the reforms and faced severe persecution from the state and the official church. This schism had lasting social and religious implications, creating a deep divide within Russian society that persisted for generations. By the end of the 17th century, the Romanov dynasty had successfully stabilized Russia, expanded its territory significantly, particularly in Siberia, and established a more robust, centralized autocratic system. The lessons of the time of troubles had been well learned. Strong central rule, a unified national church, and a disciplined social order were seen as essential for the survival and prosperity of the state. However, Russia remained largely isolated from the major intellectual and technological currents of Western Europe, a vast, slowly expanding land gazing inward. This would soon change dramatically with the ascension of a figure who would, with immense force, turn Russia's gaze westward and reshape its destiny with an iron will, a transformation as sweeping as the Siberian blizzard. As the 17th century drew to a close, Russia, under the early Romanovs, had solidified its internal control and expanded dramatically across the vastness of Siberia. It was an immense, landlocked power, largely self-sufficient, but also in many ways as an enigma to the rapidly modernizing nations of Western Europe. Its focus had been primarily on internal consolidation and eastern expansion, creating a distinct trajectory from the maritime empires developing further west. However, the world outside Russia's vast borders was evolving, and the need to engage with it to secure vital access to the seas was becoming increasingly apparent. This growing awareness set the stage for a period of more outward-looking expansion, moving beyond the familiar forests and steppes, like a great bear finally stretching its paws towards distant waters. While Siberia had provided an immense new frontier and a rich source of furs, Russia remained largely without reliable, ice-free access to major European trade routes. The White Sea, in the far north, offered a difficult and often frozen path to the Atlantic, while the Black Sea was controlled by the Ottoman Empire and the Baltic Sea by Sweden. These geographical constraints limited Russia's economic development and its ability to exert influence on the European stage. The desire for a window to the west, a reliable port that could facilitate trade and diplomatic relations, became a driving ambition for successive Romanov rulers. This was less a matter of wanting a better view and more about needing a bigger door to the global marketplace. The focus of this continued expansion was multi-directional, reflecting the diverse geopolitical landscape surrounding Russia. To the west, the long-standing rivalry with Poland-Lithuania continued. The two powers had a shared border and a history of conflict, particularly over the fertile lands of Ukraine and Belarus. The Cossacks, a semi-nomadic, militarized people living on the southern frontiers, often played a pivotal role in these conflicts, shifting their allegiances between Moscow and Warsaw. In 1654, the Pereyaslav Agreement saw a significant portion of the Ukrainian Cossacks swear allegiance to the Russian Tsar, marking a pivotal moment in Russia's westward expansion and setting the stage for centuries of complex relations between Russia and Ukraine. This was a long, drawn-out process, not a swift conquest, a slow but steady annexation of lands and peoples. To the south, the challenge came from the formidable Ottoman Empire and its vassal, the Crimean Khanate. These were powerful Islamic states that frequently launched raids into southern Russian territories, seizing slaves and disrupting trade. Russian efforts to gain access to the Black Sea were repeatedly thwarted, highlighting the need for a stronger military and a more modern navy. These were not just border skirmishes, they were clashes of civilizations with significant religious and cultural dimensions. Meanwhile, the relentless push into Siberia continued. The fur trade, particularly in sable, remained an immensely lucrative enterprise, filling the state coffers and funding other imperial endeavors. Explorers and adventurers, often Cossacks, continued to push eastward, mapping new territories, establishing trading posts, and encountering diverse indigenous peoples. Forts were built, new administrative centers established, and slowly, a vast infrastructure of control was laid across the immense landmass. This expansion was generally characterized by a slow, steady pace, like the quiet persistence of a glacier, carving out new pathways across the continent. These pioneers, often incredibly hardy individuals, ventured into uncharted wilderness, driven by both economic opportunity and a spirit of adventure. Historians still argue whether this eastward expansion was primarily driven by economic incentives or by the innate desire for territorial acquisition common to all nascent empires. The early Romanovs also began to tentatively engage with Western European ideas and technologies, though on a limited scale. They recognized the need for military modernization, purchasing firearms, and inviting foreign military instructors to train Russian forces. Diplomatic missions were occasionally sent abroad, and a few foreign specialists, particularly engineers and artisans, were allowed to settle in Moscow. This was a cautious and selective process aimed at acquiring practical knowledge rather than embracing broad cultural change. It was a bit like peering through a keyhole to see what the neighbors were up to rather than throwing the whole door open. The reigns of Tsar Alexis Terstierns, Mikhail Romanov's son, and his successor, Fyodor III, saw further consolidation of state power and a gradual strengthening of the military. Alexis I, in particular, was a notable figure, overseeing the adoption of the Ulogeny of 1649, which codified serfdom and grappling with the church schism that divided Russian Orthodoxy. These were periods of continued internal development, but Russia remained by and large a traditional conservative society, steeped in its own unique customs and resistant to radical change. The slow, rhythmic life of the Russian countryside, punctuated by religious festivals and the changing seasons, continued much as it had for centuries. However, a subtle shift was occurring beneath the surface. The need for modernization, particularly in military affairs, was becoming undeniable. The wars with Poland-Lithuania and Sweden highlighted Russia's technological and tactical inferiority compared to its Western rivals. The traditional, largely peasant army, while vast, was often outmatched by smaller, more professional European forces. The vast potential of Russia's resources remained largely untapped due to antiquated production methods. This growing awareness of a technological gap, a slow realization that merely being large was not enough, would soon ignite a spark. The stage was being set for a dramatic, almost explosive transformation, one that would be driven by a single colossal figure who would force Russia into the modern world, whether it wanted to go or not. The quiet expansion of the early Romanovs was merely a prelude to a far grander and far more disruptive play. The quiet, almost imperceptible shift towards Western engagement that began under the earlier Romanovs was about to explode into a whirlwind of radical transformation, all thanks to one of the most towering figures in Russian history, Peter the Great. His reign from 1682 to 1725 was not merely a period of reform, but a forceful, almost brutal reshaping of Russian society, politics, and culture, driven by a singular vision to drag Russia, kicking and screaming if necessary, into the ranks of European great powers. It was a change so profound, so all-encompassing, that it truly marked the beginning of the Russian Empire as a fully integrated outward-looking force on the global stage. Imagine, if you will, the serene balalaika melody being suddenly interrupted by the blare of a military trumpet and the clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Peter's formative years were unusual for a czar. As a young man, he spent significant time outside the confines of the Kremlin, mingling with foreigners in Moscow's German quarter, learning about shipbuilding, military engineering, and various trades. This early exposure to Western ideas and technologies ignited in him a lifelong passion for modernization. He possessed an insatiable curiosity and an immense personal drive, often working alongside artisans and laborers, getting his hands dirty in a way no previous Russian monarch ever had. He even undertook the famous Grand Embassy to Western Europe from 1697 to 1698, traveling incognito, or at least attempting to, as a man of his stature and height was hard to hide, through Holland, England, and other nations. During this journey, he absorbed knowledge about shipbuilding, naval architecture, industry, and governance, returning with a fierce determination to implement similar advancements in Russia. It was less a diplomatic tour and more an industrial espionage mission, complete with a giant walking around asking a lot of questions. Upon his return, Peter launched an audacious and sweeping program of Westernization and modernization. He understood that Russia's backwardness, particularly in military and naval technology, rendered it vulnerable and relegated it to a secondary role in European affairs. His reforms were extensive, affecting nearly every aspect of life. He abolished the old, often inefficient, Boyar Duma and replaced it with a more centralized system of collegia, ministries, and a governing senate, designed along Swedish lines. The outdated system of local administration was reformed, and a more rational system of provinces was introduced. He demanded that the nobility serve the state, either in the military or in civil service, making service a cornerstone of their status. Perhaps the most famous, and certainly the most visually striking of his reforms, was the forced adoption of Western customs. He famously ordered his boyars to shave their long beards and adopt Western clothing, even personally snipping off beards at court. This wasn't merely a fashion statement. It was a symbolic break with old traditions and a forceful assertion of his desire to modernize Russia's image. He introduced the Julian calendar, reformed the alphabet, and promoted education, sending young Russians abroad to study and establishing specialized schools within Russia, focusing on navigation, engineering, and military sciences. These changes were often met with resistance, sometimes fierce, from traditionalists who clung to the old ways. But Peter was not a man to be swayed by dissent. He often used brutal methods to enforce his will, proving that he was indeed a ruler to be feared as well as admired. The cornerstone of Peter's reforms, however, was military and naval modernization. He understood that a strong army, and crucially a navy, were essential for Russia to compete with European powers and secure access to warm water ports. He dramatically expanded the standing army, introducing conscription for peasants and establishing a regular, disciplined force trained along European lines. He personally oversaw the creation of the Russian Navy, starting almost from scratch. He learned shipbuilding himself, bringing in foreign experts and establishing shipyards on the Baltic and Black Seas. This immense undertaking required vast resources and manpower, often extracted from the peasantry through heavy taxes and forced labor. The culmination of Peter's military ambitions was the Great Northern War, 1700–1721, against Sweden, the dominant power in the Baltic region. This long and brutal conflict was fought to achieve Peter's primary foreign policy goal, securing a window to the Baltic Sea. Initially, Russia suffered humiliating defeats, most notably at the Battle of Narva in 1700. However, Peter learned from his mistakes, reorganized his forces, and persevered. The decisive turning point came with the Battle of Poltava in 1709, where the modernized Russian army inflicted a crushing defeat on the Swedish forces of King Charles XIII. This victory fundamentally shifted the balance of power in Northern Europe, marking the end of Sweden's dominance and the emergence of Russia as a major European military power. It was a truly transformative moment, proving the efficacy of Peter's arduous reforms. During the Great Northern War, Peter undertook his most ambitious and enduring project, the founding of St. Petersburg. In 1703, on marshy, inhospitable land captured from Sweden at the mouth of the Neva River, he began construction of a new capital city. This was no small feat. It was a monumental undertaking, built on forced labor, often at immense human cost, earning it the grim nickname, a city built on bones. Yet it was a strategic masterpiece, a modern European-style city designed to be Russia's gateway to the West, a symbol of its new imperial ambitions. It was a city that looked towards Europe, physically and philosophically, turning Russia's gaze outward. Peter the Great's reign laid the foundations of the Russian Empire, transforming it into a formidable European power. He created a centralized autocratic state, built a powerful army and navy, established new industries, and reshaped Russian culture along Western lines. While his methods were often harsh and his reforms disruptive, his vision was undeniably grand. He instilled in Russia a relentless drive for modernization and expansion that would continue for centuries. He literally put Russia on the European map, an achievement as vast as the lands he ruled, leaving behind a nation profoundly altered, forever gazing westward from the magnificent city he built. Historians still argue whether Peter's reforms were a necessary, albeit brutal, step towards modernization, or if they ultimately stifled organic development and exacerbated social divisions. The colossal figure of Peter the Great left behind an empire fundamentally transformed, yet also created a vacuum of leadership that proved difficult to fill. His radical reforms and forceful personality had centralized power to an unprecedented degree, but he had also failed to establish a clear line of succession, leading to a tumultuous period known as the Age of Palace Revolutions. This was a time when the very stability of the newly minted Russian Empire seemed to hang by a thread, with the throne often decided not by dynastic right, but by the intrigues of court factions and the whims of the powerful guard regiments. Imagine, if you will, the grand imperial palace now echoing with the whispers of conspiracy rather than the booming commands of the great Tsar. It was a rather undignified period for such a grand new empire, a bit like a magnificent orchestra trying to play without a conductor, with everyone vying for the baton. Upon Peter's death in 1725, his second wife, Catherine I, ascended to the throne, largely due to the support of Peter's close confidant, Alexander Menshikov, and the powerful Preobrazhensky and Semenovsky Guards regiments. Catherine was a remarkable figure in her own right, having risen from humble origins to become empress. However, her reign was short and largely guided by her advisors. This established a dangerous precedent. The throne was now accessible to those who could garner sufficient support from the nobility and, crucially, the military, rather than being solely based on direct male lineage. It set the stage for a series of swift and often violent changes in leadership. The reigns that followed were a rapid succession of relatively weak rulers, often young, inexperienced, or easily manipulated. These included Peter II, the teenage grandson of Peter the Great, and Anna Ivanovna, a niece of Peter the Great, who was invited to the throne by the Supreme Privy Council, a powerful aristocratic body. Anna initially accepted conditions that would have limited her autocratic power, but she quickly abrogated them, relying on her German advisors and the guard regiments to solidify her authority. Her reign and that of her successor, the infant Ivan VI, saw significant influence wielded by foreign favorites and continuation of palace intrigue. This period was characterized by a constant struggle for power between various court factions, old boyar families, the newly established Petrine nobility, and the ever-influential guard regiments. The army, particularly the elite guards, became kingmakers, their loyalty essential for any aspiring monarch. Coup became a disturbingly regular feature of Russian political life. The mechanism was often surprisingly simple: a group of disgruntled nobles, a charismatic leader, and the promise of rewards to the guards, culminating in a swift, often bloodless takeover of the Winter Palace. It was a rather dramatic, if effective, way to change leadership, though probably not ideal for long-term stability. Despite the political instability at the top, the fundamental structures of the Petrine state, including the modernized army and navy and the centralized bureaucracy, largely endured. The momentum of Peter's reforms, particularly in military and administrative spheres, continued, albeit at a slower pace. The empire continued to expand its influence, notably in the south, where conflicts with the Ottoman Empire were ongoing, driven by the persistent desire for access to the Black Sea. Diplomacy also continued, often orchestrated by powerful chancellors and ministers who provided a degree of continuity amidst the revolving door of rulers. A significant figure in this period of transition was Elizabeth Petrovna, Peter the Great's daughter. She came to power in 1741 through a dramatic palace coup, overthrowing the infant Ivan VI and his regents with the support of the guards. Elizabeth's reign, 1741 to 1762, is often seen as a return to the spirit of her father's rule, though perhaps with a lighter touch. She favored Russian national interests over foreign influences, abolished some of the hated German factions at court, and cultivated a more splendid, culturally vibrant court life, reminiscent of European monarchies. She was known for her love of fashion, theater, and the arts, bringing a touch of glamour to the stern imperial machine. Under her patronage, the first Russian university was founded in Moscow in 1755 and the Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg, fostering the development of Russian culture and education. Elizabeth also continued Peter's foreign policy of active engagement in European affairs. Russia participated in the War of the Austrian Succession, and most significantly, the 7 Years' War, 1756 and 1763, a truly global conflict. During the 7 Years' War, Russian forces achieved notable successes against Prussia, even briefly occupying Berlin. This demonstrated Russia's growing military might and its increasing role as a key player in the European balance of power. It was a clear signal that Russia was no longer just an Eastern curiosity, but a formidable force to be reckoned with. However, the age of palace revolutions was not yet over. Elizabeth's chosen heir was her nephew, Peter III, a German-born prince who was a fervent admirer of the Prussian king Frederick the Great. Upon his ascension in 1762, Peter III immediately withdrew Russia from the 7 Years' War, abandoning all gains against Prussia, a move that alienated the Russian nobility and the military. He also introduced unpopular reforms and alienated the Orthodox Church. His reign was remarkably short, lasting only 6 months. He was overthrown in yet another palace coup, orchestrated by his intelligent and ambitious German wife, Catherine Alexeyevna. Peter III was subsequently arrested and shortly thereafter died under mysterious circumstances, most likely murdered. This final dramatic coup brought to the throne Catherine the Great, a figure who would arguably become the most enlightened and successful ruler of Russia since Peter the Great, ushering in another golden age for the Russian Empire. The age of palace revolutions, while marked by instability and intrigues, had ultimately demonstrated the increasing power of the military and the court elite in shaping Russia's destiny. It was a turbulent, often undignified path, but one that nonetheless paved the way for the reign of a truly formidable empress who would further solidify Russia's imperial ambitions and intellectual pursuits, leaving a lasting legacy that shimmered like the gilded palaces she adored. Historians still argue whether the frequency of palace coups during this period indicates a fundamental flaw in Peter's autocratic system or merely the growing pains of a rapidly modernizing state. Emerging from the tumultuous age of palace revolutions, Russia found itself under the rule of a monarch who would not only restore stability, but also usher in an era of intellectual blossoming and unprecedented territorial expansion. This was Catherine II, known to history as Catherine the Great, whose reign from 1762 to 1796 is often hailed as a golden age for the Russian Empire, a period deeply influenced by the ideas of the European Enlightenment. Her ascension to the throne, as we recall, was not by direct inheritance, but through a swift and decisive coup against her unpopular husband, Peter III, showcasing the continued power of the Guard regiments. However, unlike her immediate predecessors, Catherine proved to be a ruler of immense intellect, ambition, and political skill, transforming a precarious hold on power into a firm and enduring reign. She truly knew how to wield the imperial scepter and perhaps a quill pen with equal dexterity. Catherine, born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess, meticulously prepared herself for the role she would eventually seize. She immersed herself in Russian culture, converted to Orthodoxy, and avidly read the works of Enlightenment philosophers such as Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Diderot. These intellectual currents profoundly shaped her worldview and her approach to governance. She corresponded regularly with prominent European thinkers, projecting an image of Russia as a progressive, enlightened power. This was a deliberate effort to overcome the perception of Russia as a barbaric, distant land and integrate it more fully into the European intellectual sphere. It was a bit like a student trying to impress their professors by quoting all the right books, but in this case, the student was an empress. Inspired by Enlightenment ideals, Catherine embarked on a series of ambitious, though sometimes contradictory, reforms. She convened the Legislative Commission in 1767, inviting representatives from various social classes to help revise Russia's law code. While the commission ultimately failed to produce a comprehensive new code, it provided Catherine with invaluable insight into the needs and grievances of her subjects and allowed her to project an image of a benevolent and progressive monarch. Her instruction, nakaz, to the commission, a lengthy document advocating for the rule of law, religious tolerance, and the abolition of torture, showcased her commitment to these ideals, even if their practical implementation often fell short of the grand pronouncements. Catherine also paid significant attention to education and culture. She established schools for girls, founded the Hermitage Museum, originally her private collection, and encouraged the development of Russian literature and theater. St. Petersburg flourished as a vibrant cultural capital, attracting artists, architects, and intellectuals from across Europe. She was a patron of the arts and sciences, keen to elevate Russia's standing in the intellectual world. This cultural blossoming was a deliberate part of her project to modernize Russia and align it with the leading European nations. However, her commitment to Enlightenment principles was often tempered by the realities of maintaining absolute power in a vast and diverse empire. While she spoke of liberty and justice, she also brutally suppressed the Pugachev Rebellion, 1773-1775, a massive peasant uprising led by Yemelyan Pugachev, who claimed to be the deceased Peter III. This revolt, which threatened the very foundations of the state, revealed the deep-seated social tensions in Russia and solidified Catherine's conservative stance on serfdom, which she ultimately strengthened rather than abolished. The fear of chaos, remember, was a strong motivator for absolute rule in Russia, a lesson deeply ingrained from the time of troubles. Despite these internal contradictions, Catherine's reign was undeniably a period of spectacular territorial expansion and military success, cementing Russia's position as a dominant force in Europe and Asia. Her foreign policy was bold and aggressive, driven by a desire to secure Russia's borders, gain access to warm water ports, and expand its influence. Her most significant triumphs came against the Ottoman Empire. Through two successful Russo-Turkish wars, 1768-1774 and 1787-1792, Russia gained substantial territories along the Black Sea coast, including the crucial port of Odessa and full control of the Crimean Peninsula. The Treaty of Kuchuk-Kainarka, 1774, was particularly momentous, granting Russia direct access to the Black Sea and the right to protect Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire, a provision that would serve as a pretext for future interventions. This was a long-sought goal, finally achieved, opening up vital trade routes and projecting Russian power into the Mediterranean region. It was like finally getting that extra-large window you always wanted, but in this case, it was a massive strategic waterway. Catherine also played a central role in the infamous partitions of Poland. As we will delve into in the next section, the once mighty Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, weakened by internal strife and an elective monarchy, became a tempting target for its more powerful neighbors, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Catherine, eager to expand Russia's western borders and incorporate lands historically inhabited by Orthodox populations, orchestrated and participated in all three partitions, 1772, 1793, 1795, effectively wiping Poland off the map as an independent state for over a century. These acquisitions added vast new territories and millions of new subjects to the Russian Empire, making it the largest state in Europe. By the end of her reign, Catherine the Great had significantly expanded Russia's borders to the west, south, and east, solidifying its position as a major European and Asian power. She left behind a grand empire, more centralized, more culturally refined, and infinitely more powerful than the one she inherited. Her rule embodied the paradox of enlightened absolutism, a belief in progress and reason coupled with an unwavering commitment to autocratic power. She understood that while ideas might be beautiful, the realities of governing such a vast domain often required a firm hand, perhaps even an iron fist in a velvet glove. Her legacy remains a subject of intense historical debate, but her impact on the shape and character of the Russian Empire is undeniable, a period shimmering with both brilliance and the harsh glare of imperial expansion. Historians still argue whether Catherine's enlightened pronouncements were genuine reflections of her political philosophy, or primarily a sophisticated form of propaganda designed to impress European intellectuals. Section 13. The reign of Catherine the Great, as we've seen, was a period of vast territorial acquisition for the Russian Empire, and no aspect of this expansion was as dramatic or as controversial as the partitions of Poland. This was not a single event, but a series of three coordinated divisions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth among its powerful neighbors, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, occurring in 1772, 1793, and 1795. These acts effectively erased an independent sovereign nation from the map of Europe for over a century, fundamentally reshaping the political landscape of Eastern Europe and adding millions of new subjects to the Russian crown. It was, in essence, a geopolitical game of musical chairs, where Poland unfortunately ran out of seats. To understand the partitions, one must first understand the unique and increasingly precarious position of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Once a vast and powerful state that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, it had, by the 18th century, fallen into a state of severe internal weakness. Its political system, characterized by the liberum veto, the right of any member of the Sejm or parliament to unilaterally block legislation, and an elective monarchy, made it virtually impossible to enact meaningful reforms or present a united front against external pressures. Imagine trying to run a country where every single decision needed unanimous consent and anyone could just yell no and go home. This inherent weakness invited the interference of its more centralized and militarily powerful neighbors. Russia, under Catherine the Great, played the most dominant role in orchestrating the partitions. Her motives were a blend of strategic ambition, ideological claims, and opportunism. From a strategic perspective, acquiring Polish territory extended Russia's western borders, removed a potential buffer state that could align with rivals, and provided access to new resources and populations. Ideologically, Catherine asserted that Russia had a right and a duty to protect the Orthodox Christian population within the Commonwealth, many of whom resided in territories that had historically been part of Kievan Rus. This was a convenient justification for territorial grabs, of course. The first partition of Poland in 1772 was largely a direct consequence of the ongoing Russo-Turkish War. Austria and Prussia, nervous about Russia's growing power and its gains against the Ottoman Empire, proposed a division of Polish territory as a way to maintain the balance of power. Catherine, ever the pragmatist, agreed. Russia received a significant portion of eastern Belarus and Livonia, territories with a largely Orthodox population. Prussia gained strategically important West Prussia, connecting its two main territories, while Austria took Galicia. This initial partition, while substantial, left the rump of Poland still technically independent, though severely weakened. It was a clear warning, but one that the Poles, due to their internal divisions, were largely unable to heed. The Polish attempt at internal reform after the first partition, culminating in the adoption of the Constitution of May 3rd, 1791, was a heroic but ultimately tragic effort to strengthen the Commonwealth and prevent further incursions. This constitution, one of the first modern constitutions in Europe, sought to abolish the liberum veto, establish a hereditary monarchy, and create a more efficient government. However, these reforms were seen as a threat by Russia and Prussia, who preferred a weak, malleable Poland. A group of conservative Polish magnates, resistant to the reforms, formed the Targowica Confederation and appealed to Catherine for intervention. This provided Catherine with the pretext she needed. The second partition of Poland in 1793 was a direct result of Russian and Prussian military intervention. Russian forces entered Poland, ostensibly to restore order and suppress the constitutional reforms. Prussia, seizing the opportunity, also invaded. This partition was even more devastating than the first. Russia gained vast swathes of land in western Ukraine and Belarus, while Prussia annexed more territory in western Poland, including the cities of Gdansk and Torun. This left Poland a mere shadow of its former self, a small, landlocked state entirely dependent on the whims of its powerful neighbors. It was a rather efficient way of dismembering a country if one were inclined towards such a grim endeavor. The Poles, however, were not entirely without spirit. Enraged by the second partition, a national uprising led by Tadeusz Kościuszko erupted in 1794. Kościuszko, a veteran of the American Revolutionary War, led a valiant but ultimately doomed attempt to restore Polish independence. Despite initial successes, the poorly armed Polish forces were no match for the combined might of the Russian and Prussian armies. The suppression of the Kosciuszko uprising was brutal, leading directly to the final act of the tragedy. The Third Partition of Poland in 1795 formally extinguished the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Russia, Prussia, and Austria divided the remaining territory among themselves. Russia acquired the largest share, including the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Courland, and most of the remaining Ukrainian and Belarusian lands, bringing its western border deep into Central Europe. This final act of dismemberment marked the complete disappearance of an independent Poland from the map for 123 years. The partitions of Poland had profound consequences for the Russian Empire. It significantly expanded Russia's territory and population, particularly with a large number of Catholic and Jewish subjects, which would pose new challenges for imperial governance. It solidified Russia's position as a dominant force in Eastern Europe, shaping its future foreign policy and its long-standing rivalry with Austria and Prussia. For the Poles, it was a national catastrophe, but it also fueled a fervent sense of national identity and a long struggle for independence that would continue for generations. Historians still argue about the precise motivations of the partitioning powers, with some emphasizing strategic calculations and others highlighting the ideological justifications. But the outcome was undeniably a massive expansion of the Russian Empire's western reach, bringing it closer than ever to the heart of Europe. With the vast acquisitions from the partitions of Poland, the Russian Empire entered the 19th century as an undisputed behemoth, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean and from the Arctic to the Black Sea. Yet this immense power was soon to be tested by the most cataclysmic conflict Europe had yet seen, the Napoleonic Wars. Russia's involvement in these wars, particularly the pivotal events of 1812, would not only define its role as a leading European power, but also leave an enduring mark on its national consciousness, a story that would echo like a distant cannon fire across the vast plains. The early 19th century saw France, under the military genius of Napoleon Bonaparte, rise to unprecedented dominance in Europe. Napoleon's ambition to create a continent-wide empire inevitably brought him into conflict with the other major European powers, including Russia. Initially, Russia, under Emperor Paul I, Catherine the Great's son, joined coalitions against France, but Paul's erratic foreign policy led to a brief alliance with Napoleon before his assassination in 1801. His son, Alexander I, who ascended to the throne, began his reign with a mix of liberal ideals and strategic pragmatism. Alexander I initially joined the Third Coalition against France. However, after a series of devastating defeats for the coalition, most notably at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, where the combined Austro-Russian forces were decisively routed by Napoleon, Russia was forced to reconsider its strategy. The subsequent Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, signed personally by Alexander I and Napoleon on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, marked a temporary alliance between the two emperors. This treaty divided Europe into spheres of influence and, crucially, forced Russia to join the continental system, Napoleon's embargo against British trade. This agreement was deeply unpopular in Russia, as it severely harmed its economy, which relied heavily on trade with Great Britain. Imagine being forced to boycott your favorite store, even if it meant your own livelihood suffered. It was precisely that kind of economic pinch. Despite the alliance, tensions between Russia and France steadily mounted. Napoleon's continued expansion in Europe, his creation of the Duchy of Warsaw on Russia's western border, a clear threat to Russian influence in Poland, and the growing economic hardship caused by the continental system, all contributed to a deepening rift. Both sides began to prepare for war, a sense of inevitable conflict hanging in the air like a heavy, humid summer storm. The inevitable arrived in June 1812, when Napoleon launched his catastrophic invasion of Russia. He assembled the largest army ever seen in European history up to that point, the Grande Armée, a multinational force numbering over 600,000 men. His objective was clear: to swiftly defeat the Russian army in a decisive battle and force Alexander I to comply with his demands. This was to be a quick, decisive campaign, or so he thought. The Russian strategy, largely formulated by Prince Mikhail Barclay de Tolly and later executed by General Mikhail Kutuzov, was one of strategic retreat and scorched earth. They avoided pitched battles, drawing the Grande Armée deeper and deeper into the vastness of the Russian interior, stretching Napoleon's supply lines to their breaking point. As they retreated, the Russians systematically destroyed anything that could be of use to the advancing French. Crops were burned, wells poisoned, and towns evacuated. It was a harsh, agonizing tactic, but brilliantly effective. The French found themselves marching through an empty, silent land, a stark landscape that offered no sustenance, only endless distances. It was a bit like trying to run a marathon through an empty supermarket. The only major pitched battle of the campaign was the horrific Battle of Borodino in September 1812, just outside Moscow. It was one of the bloodiest single-day battles in history, with immense casualties on both sides. While the battle itself was tactically inconclusive, the Russians ultimately withdrew, leaving the path open to Moscow. Napoleon entered Moscow a week later, expecting to find the city's keys and a Russian delegation ready to surrender. Instead, he found a largely deserted city, which soon erupted in a massive fire, destroying much of its infrastructure and denying the French vital winter quarters. Historians still argue whether the burning of Moscow was a deliberate act of Russian policy or largely accidental, but its devastating impact on Napoleon's campaign is undeniable. Stranded in a burnt-out city with dwindling supplies, facing the onset of the brutal Russian winter, and with no sign of Russian surrender, Napoleon was forced to begin his disastrous retreat in October 1812. The retreat was an unimaginable nightmare. Harassed by Russian partisan attacks, decimated by starvation, disease, and the merciless cold, the Grande Armée disintegrated. Thousands perished daily, their bodies littering the frozen landscape. The crossing of the Berezina River was particularly catastrophic, a desperate attempt by the shattered French remnants to escape the pursuing Russians. Only a fraction of Napoleon's original army managed to limp out of Russia. It was a defeat of truly epic proportions, a testament to the unforgiving nature of the Russian winter and the resilience of its people. The victory in the Patriotic War of 1812 as it became known in Russia, propelled Alexander III to newfound prestige and Russia to the forefront of European politics. Russian forces pursued Napoleon's retreating army across Europe, playing a central role in the Sixth Coalition that eventually defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, and later in his final downfall. Russia's victory instilled a deep sense of national pride and a belief in its unique destiny, even while revealing the stark contrasts between the heroic resilience of its people and the continuing backwardness of its society, particularly the persistence of serfdom. The ghost of 1812 would long haunt the collective memory of the Russian people, a story of immense sacrifice and ultimate triumph, a profound narrative of national identity forged in the crucible of war, forever linking the vastness of the land to the indomitable spirit of its inhabitants. The immense triumph over Napoleon in 1812 elevated Russia to the status of a leading power in Europe, a veritable gendarme of Europe, as some called it. Emperor Alexander IV played a pivotal role in the Congress of Vienna, which reshaped the continent after the Napoleonic Wars, advocating for a conservative order and the suppression of revolutionary movements. However, beneath this veneer of international prestige and national pride, deep-seated internal tensions simmered. The very soldiers who had fought heroically against Napoleon had witnessed the more advanced societies of Western Europe, particularly those without serfdom. They returned home with new ideas, new questions, and a growing sense of discontent with Russia's autocratic system and the continued existence of serfdom. This clash between Russia's newfound external power and its persistent internal backwardness would lead to an explosive moment, the Decembrist Revolt. It was a whisper of dissent, slowly growing into a roar, a stark contrast to the triumphant martial music of 1812. The seeds of the Decembrist Revolt were sown by a generation of young, educated, and often aristocratic officers who had served in the Napoleonic Wars or had been educated in the spirit of the Enlightenment. They formed secret societies, debating the future of Russia and criticizing the autocratic system, the stifling censorship, and, most vehemently, the institution of serfdom. These were not radical revolutionaries in the mold of the French Jacobins. Rather, they were mostly patriotic reformers who believed that Russia needed fundamental change to fulfill its true potential. They envisioned a Russia with a constitution, guaranteed civil liberties, and crucially, the emancipation of the serfs. It was a rather idealistic vision, perhaps, for a society so steeped in tradition and absolute power, a bit like trying to teach a bear to waltz. The opportunity, or perhaps the catalyst, for their audacious plan arose unexpectedly with the sudden death of Alexander VI in December 1825. Alexander had no legitimate male heir. His younger brother, Constantine, had secretly renounced his claim to the throne, leaving the path open for their youngest brother, Nicholas. However, the renunciation was not publicly known, leading to a period of confusion and an interregnum. The imperial guard and various officials initially swore allegiance to Constantine. This moment of dynastic uncertainty was precisely what the conspirators, now known as the Decembrists, had been waiting for. On December 14, 1825, hence their name, a group of approximately 3,000 soldiers, led by several Decembrist officers, assembled in Senate Square in St. Petersburg, refusing to swear allegiance to Nicholas I. They demanded a constitution and the ascension of Constantine, believing he would be more amenable to reforms. Their plan, however, was poorly coordinated, lacking a clear strategy or widespread popular support. The absence of key leaders, who failed to appear, further crippled their efforts. They mostly stood in the square, refusing orders rather than taking decisive action. It was a rather polite rebellion, if there ever was one, lacking the ruthless efficiency often required for such grand endeavors. The newly proclaimed Emperor Nicholas III, a man of stern will and conservative convictions, responded decisively. After several hours of attempts at negotiation and persuasion, during which a prominent general was killed, Nicholas ordered artillery to fire on the assembled rebels. The uprising was quickly and brutally suppressed. Many rebels were killed or wounded, and hundreds were arrested. The frozen square, usually a place for parades and imperial pomp, became a grim tableau of crushed aspirations. The aftermath of the Decembrist revolt was swift and severe. Nicholas the Maeshiel personally oversaw the investigation, determined to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy and prevent any future challenges to his autocratic rule. 5 of the leading conspirators, including Pavel Pestel and Kondraty Rylayev, were tried and executed by hanging, a rare occurrence for Russian nobles at the time. Hundreds more were exiled to hard labor in Siberia, a grim journey into the vast, unforgiving eastern reaches of the empire, becoming martyrs and symbols of revolutionary struggle for future generations. Their sentences were harsh, designed to serve as a chilling deterrent. The Decembrist revolt, though a small-scale and ultimately failed uprising, had a profound impact on the reign of Nicholas I and on Russian history. Nicholas, deeply shaken by the challenge to his authority so early in his reign, became an ardent defender of autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationality, a triad of principles that would define his conservative rule. He believed that strong, unquestioning autocratic power was the only way to prevent chaos and maintain order in Russia, a conviction reinforced by the recent events. He saw liberalism and Western ideas as dangerous, subversive forces that threatened the very foundations of the Russian Empire. Nicholas I established a vast network of political police, the third section of His Imperial Majesty's own chancellery, to monitor dissent, suppress revolutionary ideas, and enforce strict censorship. This was an era of intellectual stagnation and political repression, often called the Iron Reign or Nicholas's Stick. Travel abroad was restricted, and universities were placed under strict government control. While there was some bureaucratic reform and improvements in infrastructure, any hint of liberal thought was met with swift suppression. Despite the repression, the Decembrist revolt left a lasting intellectual legacy. It inspired future generations of Russian revolutionaries and intellectuals, serving as a powerful symbol of resistance to autocracy. The image of the Decembrist wives, who bravely followed their exiled husbands to Siberia, became a poignant tale of devotion and defiance. The failure of the revolt also demonstrated a crucial weakness of Russian revolutionary movements for decades to come: their lack of connection with the broader peasant masses. The Decembrists were largely isolated, a small group of educated elites whose ideals were far removed from the everyday concerns of the vast majority of the population. This disconnect would prove to be a recurring challenge for those who sought to change Russia from below. The reign of Nicholas I, solidified by the suppression of the Decembrists, reinforced the centralized authoritarian nature of the Russian Empire, creating a system that, while appearing stable, was building up immense pressures beneath the surface, pressures that would eventually erupt in new forms of conflict. The rigid, authoritarian reign of Nicholas I, solidified by the crushing of the Decembrist revolt, maintained an outward appearance of stability for nearly 3 decades. Russia, under his iron hand, continued to project an image of formidable power on the European stage, acting as a bulwark against liberalism and revolution. However, beneath this seemingly calm surface, the inherent weaknesses of the autocratic system and the institution of serfdom continued to fester like an untreated wound. These internal shortcomings would be dramatically exposed and brutally highlighted by a costly and ultimately humiliating conflict: the Crimean War. This war, fought primarily between 1853 and 1856, would shatter Russia's image of invincibility and force a stark realization of its technological and social backwardness, setting the stage for significant reforms. The origins of the Crimean War were complex, a tangled web of geopolitical ambitions, religious rivalries, and strategic miscalculations. At its heart was the long-standing Eastern question, revolving around the declining Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, and the scramble among European powers for influence over its territories, particularly access to the Mediterranean. Russia, as the self-proclaimed protector of Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire, sought to expand its influence in the Balkans and gain control over the strategically vital Dardanelles and Bosphorus Straits, which controlled access from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Nicholas I, confident in Russia's military might and assuming European powers would not unite against him, overplayed his hand. He underestimated the alarm his expansionist ambitions caused in Great Britain and France, who feared Russian dominance in the region and the disruption of the balance of power. They, along with the Kingdom of Sardinia, formed an alliance to prevent Russia from gaining further ground. The primary theater of the war was the Crimean Peninsula, specifically the siege of the Russian naval base at Sevastopol. The conflict quickly exposed the stark deficiencies of the Russian military compared to the more industrialized and technologically advanced armies of Britain and France. Russian soldiers, though brave and resilient, were hampered by outdated weaponry, poor logistics, and inefficient command structures. They often fought with muskets against rifles, and their supply lines, stretched over vast distances, were notoriously inadequate. Transport relied heavily on horse-drawn carts over muddy roads, while the Allied forces could utilize steamships and rudimentary railways to move troops and supplies more efficiently. It was a rather stark demonstration of the adage, "An army marches on its stomach," or in this case, a much faster, more organized stomach. The war was a brutal and often miserable affair, characterized by primitive medical conditions, rampant disease, and unimaginably high casualty rates. Diseases like cholera and typhus often claimed more lives than battlefield wounds. The iconic figure of Florence Nightingale, pioneering modern nursing on the British side, underscored the appalling conditions and the urgent need for medical reform. For Russia, the war became a quagmire, a drain on its resources and manpower. The siege of Sevastopol alone lasted for nearly a year, a testament to the stubborn Russian defense, but also to the immense cost of holding out against superior technology and organization. News of the defeats and the heavy casualties slowly filtered back to Russia, despite strict censorship. The realization that Russia, the mighty power that had defeated Napoleon, was being outmaneuvered and outfought by Western European nations was a profound shock to the system. It exposed the fundamental flaw in Nicholas I's autocratic system. While it provided order, it stifled initiative, innovation, and the free flow of information necessary for modernization. The rigid bureaucracy and the deeply entrenched system of serfdom, which deprived the vast majority of the population of personal freedom and economic incentive, were seen as major impediments to progress. It was becoming increasingly clear that maintaining a vast, unfree labor force was not conducive to creating a dynamic, modern industrial state. Nicholas the Martyr himself, burdened by the failures of the war, died in 1855, just before the conflict concluded. His successor, Alexander II, inherited a nation that was exhausted, humiliated, and desperately in need of fundamental change. The war had served as a harsh, undeniable wake-up call. The Treaty of Paris in 1856, which officially ended the Crimean War, was a bitter pill for Russia. It forced Russia to demilitarize the Black Sea, give up its claims of protection over Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire, and concede some territorial losses in Bessarabia. While not a complete catastrophe, it was a significant setback for Russian prestige and its ambitions in the Near East. The impact of the Crimean War on Russia was immense and far-reaching. It irrevocably shattered the illusion of Russian military invincibility and exposed the deep chasm between Russia and the industrialized West. This defeat, unlike the strategic retreat of 1812, was a clear and undeniable failure on the battlefield, stemming from systemic weaknesses. It ignited a widespread desire for reform among various segments of Russian society, from liberal intellectuals to pragmatic officials who understood that the status quo was no longer sustainable. The war underscored that Russia could not remain a great power while maintaining an agrarian economy, a feudal social structure, and an outdated military. The stage was now set for the great reforms of Alexander II. The Crimean War, in its grim and painful reality, forced Russia to confront its own internal contradictions and to embark on a path of modernization that, while revolutionary in its scope, would nonetheless be carefully managed from above. It was a moment of profound introspection, a painful but necessary realization that the old ways, however deeply ingrained, could no longer serve the needs of a great empire. The balalaika, which had sounded so triumphant after 1812, now played a somber, reflective tune, hinting at the vast changes soon to sweep across the land. The humiliating defeat in the Crimean War served as a stark and undeniable catalyst for change in Russia, shattering the complacency that had settled over the empire during the conservative reign of Nicholas I. His son and successor, Alexander II, understood that radical reforms were no longer a matter of choice, but of absolute necessity for Russia to maintain its status as a great power. His reign, from 1855 to 1881, became known as the era of the Great Reforms, a period of sweeping transformations that touched nearly every aspect of Russian society, most famously culminating in the emancipation of the serfs. This was a profound shift, akin to a long frozen river finally beginning to thaw and flow, bringing both life and unpredictable currents. At the heart of Russia's backwardness and military weakness lay the deeply entrenched system of serfdom. For centuries, the vast majority of the Russian population, millions upon millions of peasants, were legally bound to the land and to their landlords, little more than chattel. This system stifled economic development, inhibited social mobility, and created immense social tension. It was an antiquated system in an increasingly industrialized world, like trying to run a modern factory with horse-drawn plows. Alexander II, unlike his father, was convinced that serfdom was not only morally reprehensible, but also economically inefficient and a source of perpetual unrest. He famously declared, "It is better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait until it is abolished from below." This was a pragmatic acknowledgement of an inevitable truth, a realization that the status quo was simply unsustainable. On February 19, 1861, Alexander II issued the Emancipation Manifesto, arguably the single most important reform in Russian history. This decree legally freed over 23 million serfs, granting them personal liberty and, crucially, the right to own land. However, the terms of emancipation were complex and often led to further hardship. While peasants received plots of land, they were required to pay redemption payments to the state over a period of 49 years to compensate their former landlords. The size and quality of the land allocated were often insufficient, and the payments were a heavy burden, leading to widespread debt and discontent among the newly freed peasantry. Moreover, the land was often granted not to individual peasants, but to the village commune, MHR, which collectively managed the land and was responsible for collecting redemption payments. This communal ownership, while ensuring a degree of social welfare, also stifled individual initiative and agricultural modernization. It was a step forward, certainly, but one that came with many practical caveats, like being given a ticket to freedom that also included a very long payment plan. The abolition of serfdom necessitated a cascade of other reforms to modernize the state and society. Alexander II introduced a comprehensive judicial reform in 1864, establishing an independent judiciary, public trials with juries, and the principle of equality before the law. This was a monumental step towards a rule of law, replacing the arbitrary and often corrupt system of justice that had previously existed. Imagine a court where evidence and argument actually mattered, rather than just who you knew or how much money you had. Also, in 1864, the Zemstvo reform established elected local self-government bodies at the district and provincial levels. These Zemstvos were responsible for local administration, including education, healthcare, and infrastructure development. While their powers were limited and dominated by the nobility, they provided valuable experience in self-governance and became important centers of local initiative and public service. This was a cautious decentralization of power, a slow turning of the reins, allowing for some local input without truly challenging the autocracy. Military reforms were also crucial, driven by the lessons of the Crimean War. Universal military conscription was introduced in 1874, replacing the long, arduous service terms of the past and reducing the total length of service. The army was modernized along European lines with improved training, weaponry, and command structures. These reforms aimed to create a smaller, more professional, and more effective fighting force capable of defending the vast empire. Economic reforms were more gradual, but the abolition of serfdom laid the groundwork for industrial development. The state actively promoted railway construction, which was vital for connecting the vast distances of the empire and facilitating trade and troop movements. Investment in industry increased, albeit slowly, with foreign capital playing an increasingly important role. Despite the breadth and significance of these reforms, they were ultimately insufficient to quell the growing discontent within Russian society. Many liberals and radicals felt that the reforms did not go far enough, particularly regarding political freedoms and the limitations on autocratic power. The emancipation of the serfs, while freeing individuals, often left them in dire economic circumstances, fueling rural unrest. The gap between the aspirations of the educated elite and the realities of the autocratic system remained vast. The latter part of Alexander II's reign was marked by growing revolutionary activity, particularly from populist and nihilist groups who resorted to terrorism to achieve their goals. These groups, frustrated by the slow pace of change and the persistence of autocracy, believed that only radical action could truly transform Russia. Several attempts were made on Alexander II's life. Tragically, in 1881, Alexander II, often hailed as the Tsar Liberator, was assassinated by a bomb thrown by a member of the Narodnaya Volya, People's Will terrorist group. He died on the very day he was scheduled to sign a decree establishing a national consultative assembly, a step that might have led Russia down a more constitutional path. His death brought an abrupt end to the era of great reforms and ushered in a period of reaction under his son, Alexander III. The assassination of the Tsar Liberator underscored the deep societal divisions and the inherent dangers of attempting to reform an autocratic system from above while simultaneously suppressing political dissent from below. The great wave of change initiated by Alexander II was transformative, undoubtedly shaping the trajectory of the Russian Empire for decades to come. Yet it also created new problems and exacerbated existing tensions, setting the stage for the tumultuous events that would eventually bring down the dynasty. Historians still argue whether Alexander II's reforms were a missed opportunity for Russia to transition to a constitutional monarchy, or if his cautious approach was the only way to manage such immense societal change in a deeply conservative empire. The assassination of Alexander II, the Tsar Liberator, by a revolutionary bomb in 1881 sent shockwaves through the Russian Empire, bringing an abrupt and tragic end to the era of great reforms. His successor, his son Alexander III, reacted to this brutal act of regicide by swinging the pendulum sharply back towards reaction and conservatism. His reign, from 1881 to 1894, was characterized by a determined effort to roll back some of his father's liberal policies, strengthen the autocracy, and suppress all forms of dissent. It was a period of tightening controls, a deliberate attempt to put the genie of reform back into the bottle, much like trying to force a wild river back into its previous, more controlled channels. Alexander III was a physically imposing man, deeply conservative and profoundly disillusioned by the perceived failures of his father's reforms, which he believed had only led to chaos and regicide. He genuinely believed that only a strong, unquestioning autocracy rooted in Orthodox faith and Russian nationalism could save the empire from disintegration. His chief ideologue and advisor was Konstantin Pobedonostsev, the Ober-Procurator of the Holy Synod, a staunch traditionalist who railed against Western liberalism, parliamentarism, and secular education. Pobedonostsev famously described democracy as the great lie of our time. This intellectual framework provided the justification for Alexander III's policies of counter-reform. The key measures of Alexander III's reign aimed at strengthening central control and suppressing opposition. The political police, the Okhrana, was significantly expanded and given broad powers to monitor, infiltrate, and crush revolutionary groups. Strict censorship was reimposed on publications and public discourse, stifling intellectual freedom. The autonomy of universities, which had been granted some self-governance under Alexander II, was curtailed, and strict controls were placed on student life. The zemstvos, the local self-government bodies, saw their powers reduced and their independence eroded. These measures were designed to create a tightly controlled society where any deviation from official ideology would be swiftly met with punishment. It was a bit like trying to keep a lid on a pressure cooker without ever turning down the heat. Simultaneously, Alexander III pursued a policy of Russification, particularly in the western borderlands of the empire. This policy aimed to assimilate non-Russian nationalities by promoting the Russian language, culture, and Orthodox faith, often at the expense of local languages, religions, and traditions. In Finland, Poland, and the Baltic provinces, local rights and institutions were curtailed. This policy, rather than fostering unity, often fueled resentment and nationalist sentiments among the affected populations, sowing seeds of future discord. One of the darker aspects of this period was the increased persecution of Jewish communities. A series of pogroms, violent anti-Jewish riots, erupted particularly in the Pale of Settlement, where most Jews were confined. While the government did not directly organize these pogroms, it often failed to intervene effectively to protect Jewish lives and property, and some officials implicitly condoned the violence. Discriminatory laws were enacted, severely restricting Jewish rights, limiting their access to education and certain professions, and making their lives increasingly precarious. This state-sanctioned discrimination would contribute to waves of Jewish immigration and deepen revolutionary sentiment among the intelligentsia. Despite the political reaction, Alexander III's reign also saw significant strides in industrialization and economic development. This was largely driven by his able finance ministers, particularly Sergei Viti, who pursued an aggressive policy of state-led industrialization. Witte recognized that Russia's future as a great power depended on its economic strength and its ability to compete with Western industrial nations. The government invested heavily in railway construction, most notably the monumental Trans-Siberian Railway, which began construction in 1891. This ambitious project, stretching across the vastness of Siberia, was not just an engineering marvel. It was a strategic imperative designed to connect European Russia with its far eastern territories, facilitate trade, and enable troop movements. It was a grand vision, literally spanning continents. The state also promoted the growth of heavy industry, particularly coal, iron, steel, and oil production. Foreign investment was actively encouraged, and protective tariffs were imposed to shield nascent Russian industries from foreign competition. This period saw the emergence of a small but growing industrial working class, concentrated in the major cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow, living in often harsh conditions. This rapid industrialization, while boosting Russia's economic output, also created new social problems and fueled the growth of an urban proletariat, a fertile ground for socialist and revolutionary ideas. The quiet, rhythmic hum of the balalaika was now accompanied by the clang of factory machinery. Alexander III's foreign policy was generally cautious and aimed at maintaining peace. He avoided major wars, preferring to consolidate Russia's internal strength and avoid costly entanglements, earning him the nickname the Peacemaker. He broke with the traditional alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, instead forming the Franco-Russian alliance in 1894, a crucial diplomatic realignment that would have significant consequences in the run-up to World War I. This shift was a clear signal that Russia was charting its own course in the complex dance of European diplomacy. By the time Alexander III died in 1894, he had undeniably strengthened the autocratic system and overseen a period of impressive economic growth. However, his repressive policies had also alienated significant segments of society, intensified ethnic tensions, and failed to address the fundamental issues of social inequality and the lack of political participation. The industrialization he championed, while bringing economic progress, also created a new class of urban workers who would soon become a powerful force for change. The pressures were building beneath the surface, much like a spring coiling tighter and tighter. His successor, his son Nicholas II, would inherit an empire outwardly strong but inwardly riddled with contradictions. An empire hurtling towards a future that would prove far more turbulent than his conservative father could ever have imagined, a future where the pressures of modernization and a rigid autocracy would ultimately collide. Section 19, the death of Alexander III in 1894, brought his son, Nicholas II, to the imperial throne, marking the beginning of the end for the Romanov dynasty, and eventually the Russian Empire itself. Nicholas inherited a vast, complex empire that was undergoing rapid industrialization, but was still governed by an antiquated autocratic system. He was a man of personal charm and deep family devotion, but utterly unsuited for the immense task of ruling such a volatile nation. He clung rigidly to the principles of absolute autocracy, famously dismissing any suggestion of constitutional reform as senseless dreams, a fatal flaw in an era demanding greater political participation. It was as if he were trying to steer a modern steamship with the mindset of a captain of a wooden sailing vessel, oblivious to the gathering storm. The late 19th and early 20th centuries in Russia were characterized by accelerating industrialization and consequently growing social unrest. Sergei Vita, Alexander III's finance minister continued his ambitious program, pushing for rapid development of heavy industry, railways, and foreign investment. The Trans-Siberian Railway was nearing completion, and new industrial centers sprang up, drawing millions of peasants from the countryside into overcrowded, often squalid, urban environments. This rapid industrialization created a burgeoning, discontented working class, concentrated in the major cities, living in harsh conditions, and ripe for revolutionary agitation. They worked long hours for low wages, often in dangerous factories, and lacked any form of political representation or protection. Alongside the industrial workers, the peasantry, still burdened by redemption payments and land hunger after the emancipation of serfs, remained a vast and volatile force. Crop failures, widespread poverty, and resentment towards the landowning nobility fueled sporadic revolts and demands for more land. Meanwhile, a growing intelligentsia, frustrated by the lack of political freedom and the pervasive censorship, increasingly embraced radical ideologies, from liberalism to various forms of socialism and anarchism. These were the intellectual sparks that would ignite the larger fires. Against this backdrop of mounting internal pressures, Russia pursued an increasingly ambitious and ultimately disastrous foreign policy. Nicholas II, while personally amiable, lacked the diplomatic shrewdness of his grandfather. His attention, and that of his advisors, turned eastward towards the Far East, where Russia sought to expand its influence in Manchuria and Korea. This ambition inevitably brought Russia into conflict with a rising Asian power. Japan, the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-1905, was a calamitous affair for Russia. Japan, a newly modernized and militarily efficient nation, inflicted a series of humiliating defeats on the Russian forces, both on land and at sea. The Russian Baltic Fleet, after an epic journey halfway around the world, was annihilated by the Japanese Navy at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905. The war exposed the glaring inefficiencies, corruption, and technological backwardness of the Russian military, much like the Crimean War had done half a century earlier. It was a complete and utter embarrassment for the proud Russian Empire, a truly jarring wake-up call if anyone was actually listening. The news of these defeats sparked outrage and widespread discontent across Russia, further eroding public trust in that autocratic regime. The humiliating defeat in the Far East, combined with the festering internal grievances, ignited the powder keg of revolution at home. The Revolution of 1905 erupted with a tragic event on January 22, 1905, a day forever etched in Russian history as Bloody Sunday. Thousands of unarmed workers, led by Father Georgy Gapon, marched peacefully to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to present a petition to the Tsar, pleading for better working conditions, civil liberties, and political reform. The Imperial Guard, instead of receiving the petition, opened fire on the demonstrators, killing and wounding hundreds. The peaceful protest turned into a massacre, shattering the myth of the Tsar as a benevolent little father and irrevocably severing the bond between the monarch and his people. It was a truly catastrophic misstep, a moment when the imperial authority fired upon its own unsuspecting subjects. Bloody Sunday ignited a wave of strikes, peasant uprisings, and political assassinations across the empire. Industrial workers, organized into Soviets, councils of workers' deputies, initially as strike committees. Peasants seized land, and mutinies broke out in the armed forces, most famously on the battleship Potemkin. The empire was teetering on the brink of full-scale civil war. Faced with an unprecedented challenge to his authority, Nicholas II, advised by Sergei Vita, reluctantly issued the October Manifesto in October 1905. This document, a major concession, promised fundamental civil liberties, including freedom of speech, assembly, and association, and, most significantly, the creation of a legislative assembly, the Duma, with powers to approve laws. This was a profound, albeit forced, step away from absolute autocracy, a reluctant acknowledgement that the old ways could no longer be sustained without some form of public participation. It was a monumental shift, like a creaky gate slowly, reluctantly swinging open. However, the October Manifesto did not fully satisfy all revolutionary demands. While some liberals accepted it as a significant step, radical groups like the Bolsheviks and socialist revolutionaries dismissed it as insufficient, a trick to appease the masses. Nicholas II, for his part, quickly sought to reassert his autocratic prerogatives. The fundamental laws of 1906 significantly limited the Duma's powers, reserving substantial authority for the Tsar and establishing a bicameral legislature with an appointed upper house that could veto Duma legislation. The Tsar retained the right to dissolve the Duma and appoint ministers, effectively making it a consultative body rather than a true parliament. It was a classic 2 steps forward, 1 step back scenario, a hesitant dance with modernity. Despite the political repression and the Tsar's reluctance to fully embrace constitutionalism, the period immediately following 1905 saw some genuine, if limited, improvements. Press freedom increased, and political parties began to form. However, the fundamental contradictions of the Russian Empire remained unresolved. A rigid autocracy attempting to govern a rapidly industrializing society with deep social inequalities and a restless population. The lessons of 1905, particularly the vulnerability of the regime to widespread unrest, would not be forgotten by either the revolutionaries or the Tsar's dwindling supporters. The stage was set for the next, even more destructive act, one that would sweep away the centuries-old empire in a maelstrom of global conflict. The tumultuous events of the 1905 revolution, though ultimately suppressed, had shaken the foundations of the Russian Empire and forced the autocratic regime to make unprecedented, if reluctant, concessions. The creation of the Duma, however limited its powers, represented a fundamental shift in the political landscape. The period between 1906 and the outbreak of World War I, often referred to as the Stolypin Reforms and the pre-war years, was a complex era of both attempted modernization and continued repression, a last, desperate effort by the Tsarist regime to stabilize the empire and avoid further revolutionary upheaval. It was a brief, uneasy calm before the truly immense storm that would finally sweep away the Romanov dynasty. At the helm of this reform effort was Pyotr Stolypin, a formidable and intelligent statesman who served as prime minister from 1906 until his assassination in 1911. Stolypin understood that simply suppressing dissent was not enough. Genuine structural reforms were needed to address the deep-seated problems of Russian society. He famously pursued a policy of pacification first, then reform, meaning he was ruthless in suppressing revolutionary terrorism and restoring order, but simultaneously committed to bold, transformative changes. He was a man of paradoxes, a strong man with a reformer's vision, a bit like trying to build a fire while simultaneously putting out embers. Stolypin's most significant and far-reaching initiative was his agrarian reform program, launched in 1906. He recognized that the traditional communal land ownership system, MIR, put in place after the 1861 emancipation, stifled individual initiative and agricultural productivity. His reforms aimed to break up the mir and create a class of prosperous, independent peasant landowners who he believed would become a conservative force supporting the regime. Peasants were given the right to consolidate their scattered strips of land into single privately owned farms and to withdraw from the commune. They were also encouraged to resettle in Siberia, where vast tracts of land were available. This was an ambitious attempt to transform Russia's agrarian economy and create a more stable social base for the autocracy. The Stolypin reforms, while successful in creating a significant number of independent peasant proprietors, the so-called kulaks, and increasing agricultural output, were met with mixed results. Many peasants were reluctant to leave the security of the commune, and the reforms often exacerbated social divisions within the countryside. However, they undeniably represented a major step towards capitalist agriculture in Russia, boosting grain exports and laying some groundwork for future economic growth. Alongside the agrarian reforms, Stolypin also focused on strengthening local administration, promoting education, and improving the lives of ordinary Russians. He pushed for universal primary education and sought to modernize the zemstvos. He genuinely believed that a prosperous and educated populace would be less susceptible to revolutionary appeals. Despite these efforts, Stolypin faced immense opposition from both ends of the political spectrum. Revolutionaries naturally viewed him as an enemy. Conservatives at court, including elements around Nicholas II, distrusted his reforms, seeing them as undermining traditional autocratic principles. The Duma, too, was a complex environment. Stolypin often clashed with the more radical elements in the Duma, dissolving two Duma that proved too obstructionist before eventually working with a more cooperative, conservative Third Duma. His assassination in 1911 by a revolutionary named Dmitry Bogrov was a tragic blow to the reform efforts and removed arguably the last statesman capable of steering Russia away from revolution. His death left a void in leadership that Nicholas II was entirely incapable of filling. In the years immediately preceding World War I, Russia continued its economic growth, fueled by industrialization and foreign investment. Cities expanded, and a vibrant, albeit politically stifled, cultural life flourished. The empire seemed, on the surface, to be gaining strength. However, the fundamental tensions remained. A burgeoning industrial working class with no political voice, a vast peasantry still yearning for more land and facing economic hardship, and an intelligentsia increasingly alienated from the regime. The national question also continued to simmer as Russification policies fueled resentment among the empire's many non-Russian nationalities. In foreign policy, Russia pursued a dual strategy of expansion in the Far East and increasing involvement in European power politics, particularly in the Balkans. After the defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, Russia shifted its focus back to Europe and the Near East. Driven by pan-Slavic sentiment and a desire to regain prestige, Russia positioned itself as the protector of Orthodox Slavs in the Balkans, bringing it into direct conflict with Austria-Hungary, which also had ambitions in the region. This rivalry, simmering for decades, would prove to be a major factor in the outbreak of World War I. Russia also strengthened its alliance with France and forged the Triple Entente with Great Britain, creating a formidable counterweight to the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary. It was a complex and dangerous dance of alliances, where a single misstep could trigger a continental conflagration. As 1914 dawned, the Russian Empire, despite its internal contradictions and simmering unrest, was undoubtedly a great power. Its army was vast, its economy growing, and its strategic alliances formidable. However, the stability was precarious, a thin veneer over deep social and political fault lines. The Tsarist regime, with Nicholas II at its head, proved unable to adapt to the demands of a modernizing society, clinging desperately to an outdated autocratic system. The lessons of 1905, the warnings of Stolypin, all seemed to fade like a dream in the face of imperial hubris and a fundamental inability to genuinely share power. When the Archduke was assassinated in Sarajevo, setting off the chain reaction that would lead to the Great War, Russia, despite its vastness and recent economic strides, would enter the global conflict as a giant with feet of clay, ill-equipped to withstand the immense pressures that total war would unleash upon its fragile internal structure. The gentle rhythm of the balalaika was about to be drowned out by the thunder of cannons. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June 1914 set off a chain reaction that plunged Europe into the conflagration known as World War I. For the Russian Empire, this conflict would prove to be the ultimate test of its resilience, a crucible that would expose every crack in its foundations and ultimately lead to its downfall. Nicholas II, despite his personal misgivings about war, felt compelled to honor Russia's alliance with Serbia and its broader role as the protector of Slavic peoples in the Balkans. He believed that swift action was necessary to maintain Russia's prestige and influence. So, with a sense of imperial destiny, Russia mobilized its vast, yet still largely unmodernized army, stepping into a conflict that would consume millions of lives and fundamentally reshape the course of the 20th century. It was a decision that echoed like a solemn, irreversible chord across the vast plains, signaling the end of an era. From the outset, Russia's participation in World War I was fraught with immense challenges. The vastness of its territory and the sheer size of its army were impressive on paper, but beneath the surface lay critical weaknesses. The industrial base, despite rapid growth under Vita and Stolypin, was insufficient to equip and supply such a massive fighting force for a prolonged industrialized war. There were chronic shortages of rifles, ammunition, artillery, and even boots. Russian factories simply could not keep pace with the insatiable demands of the front lines. Soldiers often went into battle poorly equipped, sometimes even without weapons, told to pick up a rifle from a fallen comrade. It was a logistical nightmare, a bit like trying to run a marathon when you've forgotten your running shoes. The transportation infrastructure, particularly the railway network, was inadequate for the immense task of moving millions of troops and tons of supplies across the empire's vast distances. Bottlenecks at key junctions and the general inefficiency of the system often led to critical delays and shortages at the front. The vastness of Russia, which had once been a defensive advantage, now became a logistical burden. Compounding these material deficiencies was the often incompetent military leadership. Many senior generals were products of the old aristocratic system, lacking modern tactical training or strategic vision. Nicholas II himself, against the advice of his ministers, took personal command of the army in 1915, a decision that proved disastrous. While well-intentioned, he lacked military experience and was easily influenced by those around him, particularly his wife, Empress Alexandra, and the controversial mystic Grigory Rasputin, whose increasing influence at court deeply discredited the monarchy. The image of the Tsar leading his beleaguered troops, while his family seemingly fell under the sway of a Siberian peasant, further eroded public confidence. The human cost of the war was staggering. Millions of Russian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The Eastern Front, stretching for thousands of kilometers, became a brutal meat grinder. Early successes against Austria-Hungary in Galicia were offset by devastating defeats against the more efficient German army, most notably at the Battle of Tannenberg in 1914, which saw nearly 250,000 Russian casualties and prisoners. Retreats became common. Vast territories were lost to the advancing Central Powers, and morale plummeted. The incessant flow of casualty reports back to the villages and towns of Russia created a pervasive sense of despair and anger. At home, the war placed an unbearable strain on the Russian economy and society. Food shortages became rampant in cities as the railway system prioritized military transport over civilian supplies. Inflation soared, making basic necessities unaffordable for many. Industrial production was geared towards the war effort, leading to shortages of consumer goods. The vast numbers of peasants conscripted into the army led to labor shortages in the countryside, further impacting agricultural output. Long lines for bread became a daily reality in Petrograd, as St. Petersburg was renamed during the war to sound less German, and other major urban centers. Political discontent grew exponentially. The Duma, which had been suspended at the outbreak of war, was intermittently reconvened, and its members grew increasingly vocal in their criticism of the government's incompetence. Liberals and even some conservatives urged Nicholas II to form a government of public confidence, responsible to the Duma, but the Tsar stubbornly refused, clinging to his autocratic prerogatives. He believed that any concession would undermine his God-given authority. This intransigence created an unbridgeable chasm between the monarchy and the moderate political forces that might have otherwise helped steer the empire through the crisis. The image of the Tsar and his family, increasingly isolated and seemingly out of touch, further fueled public anger. Empress Alexandra's German heritage and her perceived manipulation by Rasputin, who gained undue influence over court appointments and political decisions, became potent symbols of the monarchy's failings. Whispers of treason and incompetence permeated society, eroding the last vestiges of popular support for the Romanovs. Rasputin's assassination in December 1916, orchestrated by conservative nobles, was a desperate attempt to save the monarchy, but it came too late. The damage was already done. By early 1917, the Russian Empire was teetering on the brink of collapse. The continuous military defeats, the economic chaos, the food shortages, the widespread discontent among workers and peasants, and the utter failure of the government to address these crises all created a volatile mixture. The vast empire, which had withstood centuries of external threats and internal turmoil, was finally buckling under the strain of total war. The fabric of society was stretched to its breaking point, and the stage was set for the revolution that would sweep away the Romanov dynasty and fundamentally alter the course of Russian history, a revolution that would begin not with grand ideological pronouncements, but with the simple cry for bread. Section 22, the immense pressures of World War I, combined with centuries of unresolved social and political issues, reached a breaking point in early 1917, leading to the collapse of the Romanov autocracy in what became known as the February Revolution. This was not a meticulously planned uprising, but rather a spontaneous explosion of popular discontent, a cascade of events that swiftly toppled a dynasty that had ruled Russia for over 300 years. The vast, ancient empire, seemingly invincible to many, simply dissolved like snow under the spring sun, leaving a profound void in its wake. It was a rapid, almost bewildering unraveling of power, proving that even the most deeply entrenched systems can suddenly give way under enough strain. The initial sparks of the February Revolution, which actually occurred in March by the Gregorian calendar, hence the confusion for Western historians who often call it the March Revolution, ignited in Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg. On February 23rd, March 8th, International Women's Day, thousands of female textile workers went on strike, protesting against food shortages, terrible working conditions, and the ongoing war. They were soon joined by other workers, and within days the city was gripped by a general strike. The striking workers were quickly joined by sympathetic soldiers from the Petrograd garrison, many of whom were peasants who harbored their own grievances against the Tsar and the war. These soldiers, often poorly trained and fed, had little desire to fire on their fellow citizens. It was a spontaneous alignment of disaffected groups, a powerful, unexpected convergence of frustrations. As the protests escalated, the government's authority rapidly evaporated. Tsar Nicholas II, at the military headquarters far from the capital, initially dismissed the unrest as a minor disturbance, a typical isolated riot. He ordered the use of force to suppress the demonstrations, but the troops, crucially, refused to obey. Instead, they mutinied, joining the workers and openly siding with the revolutionaries. The police and loyal forces were quickly overwhelmed. The absence of a strong, unified response from the government, combined with the defection of the military, sealed the fate of the autocracy. It was a classic case of the center not holding, a rapid deterioration of control. Amidst this chaos, two parallel centers of power emerged in Petrograd. The first was the provisional government, formed by members of the Duma. This body, largely composed of liberal politicians, aimed to establish a democratic parliamentary republic. Its initial leaders, like Prince Georgy Lvov and later Alexander Kerensky, sought to govern Russia through a transitional period, promising reforms and preparing for the convocation of a constituent assembly that would determine Russia's future political system. They represented the aspirations of the middle class and moderate intellectuals who hoped for a gradual, orderly transition to democracy. The second, and arguably more powerful, center of authority was the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies. This council, elected by factory workers and soldiers, quickly became a voice for the urban masses and the military rank and file. It issued Order Numbered 1, which effectively gave the Soviet control over the Petrograd garrison, meaning the provisional government could not issue orders to the military without the Soviets' approval. This dual power arrangement created a chaotic and unstable political situation with neither body holding unchallenged authority. It was like having two captains on the same ship, each trying to steer in a different direction. Faced with overwhelming pressure from his generals and the Duma leaders, who informed him that his rule was no longer sustainable and that his remaining loyal troops could not guarantee order, Nicholas II reluctantly abdicated the throne on March 2, 1917. He initially tried to abdicate in favor of his son, Alexei, but then, perhaps realizing the practical difficulties of a sickly child on the throne, abdicated for both himself and his son in favor of his brother, Grand Duke Michael. However, Michael, witnessing the chaos, wisely declined the throne the following day. With Michael's refusal, the 304-year-old Romanov dynasty officially came to an end, not with a bang, but with a series of quiet, almost resigned relinquishments of power. The era of the czars was over, fading into the long annals of history. The fall of the Romanovs was met with widespread jubilation across Russia. Political prisoners were released, censorship was abolished, and a wave of revolutionary enthusiasm swept the country. People genuinely believed that a new era of freedom and justice had dawned. However, the provisional government faced immediate and immense challenges. Its fatal flaw was its decision to continue Russia's involvement in World War I. The war was immensely unpopular, draining resources and lives, and the public desperately yearned for peace. The provisional government, however, felt bound by its commitments to the Allied powers and believed that withdrawing would be a betrayal of national honor and a strategic disaster. This decision alienated the vast majority of the population, particularly the soldiers and workers. Furthermore, the provisional government struggled to address the pressing social and economic issues. Land reform, a central demand of the peasantry, was continuously postponed, as was the establishment of a constituent assembly. This hesitancy to act decisively on the issues most important to the masses created a growing vacuum of power and legitimacy. While they debated, the people suffered. Into this volatile environment, radical political parties, particularly the Bolsheviks, led by the enigmatic and determined Vladimir Lenin, began to gain traction. Lenin, who returned to Russia from exile in April 1917, famously advocated for peace, land, and bread, slogans that resonated deeply with the war-weary soldiers, land-hungry peasants, and starving workers. He called for all power to the Soviets, arguing that the provisional government was merely a bourgeois interim regime that needed to be overthrown. The Bolsheviks, initially a minority, skillfully exploited the provisional government's weaknesses, its perceived indecisiveness, and its inability to end the war or address the land question. They were patient, methodical, and relentlessly focused on seizing power. The summer of 1917 saw increasing unrest, failed military offensives, and a growing breakdown of order. The Kornilov affair, a botched military coup attempt by General Lavr Kornilov against the provisional government, inadvertently strengthened the Bolsheviks as they were instrumental in defending Petrograd against the perceived counter-revolution. This event further discredited the provisional government and swelled the ranks of the Bolshevik Red Guards, effectively arming them. The February Revolution had opened the floodgates of political freedom, but the resulting chaos and the provisional government's inability to deliver on its promises created the perfect conditions for a more radical and decisive force to seize control, promising a swift end to the war and a solution to the nation's profound problems. The stage was now set for the next, even more radical chapter in Russia's tumultuous year, one that would see the very essence of the empire stripped away and replaced with a revolutionary new order. The provisional government, born of the February Revolution, found itself caught between the immense pressures of a devastating world war and the escalating demands of a restless populace. Its fatal flaw, as we discussed, was its inability, or perhaps unwillingness, to pull Russia out of the war and decisively address the land question. This indecision created a growing power vacuum, which was expertly exploited by the most radical and determined political force in Russia, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. The summer and autumn of 1917 saw them rapidly gain strength, like a hidden current gathering momentum beneath a seemingly calm river, preparing to sweep away the old order entirely. Lenin, a brilliant strategist and an unyielding ideologue, articulated a clear and compelling vision for a new Russia, encapsulated in his simple yet powerful slogans: peace, land, and bread, and all power to the Soviets. These resonated deeply with the vast majority of the population, the war-weary soldiers, the land-hungry peasants, and the starving urban workers. The provisional government, by contrast, seemed to offer only continued war and endless debate, while other socialist parties advocated for gradual change and cooperation with the provisional government. Lenin insisted on immediate, radical action and a socialist revolution. He was a man with a singular focus, unwavering in his conviction that only a complete overthrow of the existing system could solve Russia's problems. The Bolsheviks meticulously prepared for a seizure of power. They infiltrated the Soviets, particularly the crucial Petrograd Soviet, gaining increasing support and eventually winning majorities in key leadership positions. They organized and armed the Red Guards, their own paramilitary force composed primarily of loyal factory workers. Leon Trotsky, a brilliant orator and organizer, played a crucial role in planning the military aspects of the uprising and leading the Petrograd Soviet. The stage was being meticulously set, not for a spontaneous popular uprising, but for a carefully orchestrated coup d'état. It was a well-rehearsed play, with only the final act yet to be performed. The October Revolution, which confusingly for those outside Russia, occurred in November by the Gregorian calendar, began on the night of October 25th, November 7th, 1917. Under the guise of defending the Petrograd Soviet from a supposed counter-revolutionary threat, Bolshevik Red Guards and revolutionary soldiers seized key strategic points in the capital, railway stations, post offices, bridges, and power plants. The operation was remarkably swift and relatively bloodless in Petrograd itself. The provisional government, ensconced in the Winter Palace, offered little resistance. Alexander Kerensky, the head of the provisional government, fled the city, desperately trying to rally loyal troops, but it was too late. The symbolic culmination of the revolution was the storming of the Winter Palace, the former imperial residence. While often depicted in dramatic historical accounts as a fierce battle, the reality was somewhat less theatrical. The palace was poorly defended, and the Bolshevik forces, with the support of the cruiser Aurora, which fired a blank shot as a signal, largely walked in. The remaining members of the provisional government were arrested, effectively ending their brief, ill-fated rule. It was a rather anticlimactic end for such a pivotal moment, a bit like a grand opera ending with a whimper rather than a bang. On the same night, the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets was in session when the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, moderate socialist parties, walked out in protest of the Bolshevik coup. Lenin, with his characteristic pragmatism, declared that all power had passed to the Soviets. The Council of People's Commissars, Sovnarkom, was formed with Lenin as its chairman, effectively establishing the first Soviet government. The Bolsheviks immediately issued decrees on peace and land, fulfilling their key promises to the populace. The decree on peace called for an immediate end to the war without annexations or indemnities, a popular move among the war-weary masses. The decree on land abolished private land ownership and declared all land to be the property of the state, to be distributed among the peasants, thus legitimizing the spontaneous peasant land seizures already underway. These initial decrees were immensely popular and helped consolidate Bolshevik power, particularly in the countryside. However, the Bolsheviks did not yet have full control of Russia. Their power was strongest in the major cities and among segments of the army and navy. Much of the vast countryside remained in a state of chaos, and other political forces, including moderate socialists, monarchists, and various nationalist groups, vehemently opposed the Bolshevik seizure of power. Lenin's government quickly moved to establish a one-party state. Political opponents were suppressed, non-Bolshevik newspapers were shut down, and the Cheka, Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, the new political police, was established to ruthlessly crush dissent. The democratically elected Constituent Assembly, which had been convened in January 1918, and in which the Bolsheviks had failed to win a majority, was dissolved by force after only one day. Lenin argued that the Soviets, as the direct expression of the workers' and peasants' will, were superior to a bourgeois parliament. This act clearly demonstrated the Bolsheviks' commitment to their own vision of power, rather than to multi-party democracy. The new Soviet government also faced the immediate crisis of the ongoing war. Despite the decree on peace, negotiations with the Central Powers were difficult. In March 1918, the Bolsheviks signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany and Austria-Hungary. This treaty was incredibly harsh, forcing Russia to cede vast territories, including Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, and parts of Poland, and to pay heavy indemnities. While Lenin viewed it as a necessary evil to save the revolution, it was widely condemned as a humiliating betrayal of national interests and further fueled opposition to the Bolshevik regime. It was a stark reminder that even revolutionary zeal had to contend with overwhelming military might. The October Revolution and the subsequent establishment of the Bolshevik government marked the decisive end of the old Russian Empire. The Romanov dynasty was gone, the provisional government dissolved, and a radical new ideological force had seized the reins of power. However, this was not the end of Russia's turmoil. The Bolsheviks' audacious seizure of power, their consolidations of a one-party state, and the humiliating terms of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty immediately plunged the country into a new, even more brutal conflict, the Russian Civil War, a devastating struggle that would determine the very survival of the new Soviet state and reshape the destiny of the former empire. The sound of the balalaika was now completely drowned out by the roar of cannon fire, a far more violent symphony. The Bolshevik seizure of power in October 1917, while remarkably swift in Petrograd, did not bring peace to Russia. Instead, it ignited a brutal and devastating conflict that would rage for the next 3 years, the Russian Civil War. This was not a simple two-sided struggle, but a multifaceted, chaotic, and incredibly violent contest for the soul of the former Russian Empire, pitting the fledgling Bolshevik government, known as the Reds, against a diverse array of anti-Bolshevik forces, collectively known as the Whites, along with numerous other factions and foreign interventionists. It was a period of immense suffering, widespread famine, and atrocities committed by all sides, a truly grim chapter in the history of the vast land, where the only music was the wail of the wind and the distant rattle of machine guns. The Whites were a motley collection of groups with often contradictory goals, united primarily by their opposition to the Bolsheviks. They included monarchists who wanted to restore the Tsar, though not necessarily Nicholas II, liberals who desired a democratic, constitutional government, moderate socialists who felt the Bolsheviks had betrayed the revolution, and former Tsarist military officers. They received some, often inconsistent, support from the Allied powers, Great Britain, France, the United States, and Japan, who feared the spread of Bolshevism and sought to reopen the Eastern Front against Germany. However, the Allied intervention was often half-hearted and poorly coordinated, ultimately proving ineffective. Adding to the complexity were numerous other factions. Various nationalist movements in Ukraine, the Baltics, the Caucasus, and Central Asia fought for independence from Russia, exploiting the central government's weakness. Anarchist groups, led by figures like Nestor Makhno in Ukraine, carved out their own territories, fighting both Reds and Whites. And of course, the ever-present peasant uprisings, fueled by food requisitioning by all sides, further destabilized the countryside. It was truly a bewildering kaleidoscope of conflict, where allegiances shifted like desert sands. The Bolsheviks, Reds, despite facing overwhelming odds and encirclement by their enemies, ultimately triumphed. Their victory can be attributed to several key factors. Firstly, They possessed a clear, unified ideology and a disciplined party structure, enabling them to make quick decisions and implement policies effectively. Their leadership, particularly Lenin and Trotsky, was remarkably resilient and strategic. Lenin provided the ideological drive, while Trotsky, as the Commissar of War, proved to be a brilliant military organizer, building the Red Army from scratch into a formidable fighting force. He famously used former Tsarist officers under strict political control and introduced harsh discipline, including summary executions for desertion. Secondly, the Bolsheviks controlled the industrial heartland of European Russia, including Moscow, which became the new capital, and Petrograd, giving them access to vital industrial resources, factories, and a concentration of the working class, their core support base. They also controlled the central railway network, allowing them to move troops and supplies more efficiently than their geographically dispersed opponents. Thirdly, the Whites, despite their military strength in some regions, suffered from a lack of unity and coordination. Their leaders often distrusted each other, and their political programs were vague and failed to offer a compelling alternative to the Bolsheviks for the majority of the population. They largely failed to win over the crucial peasant masses, whose desire for land the Bolsheviks had cleverly addressed with their decree on land. The peasants, having received land from the Bolsheviks, often viewed the Whites, who sometimes advocated for the return of land to former landlords, with suspicion. It was a classic example of an army needing to win hearts and minds, and the Whites struggled mightily on that front. The Civil War was fought with extreme brutality. Both sides engaged in widespread terror, summary executions, and targeting of civilians. The Bolsheviks implemented a policy known as Red Terror, a systematic campaign of repression and executions carried out by the Cheka, aimed at eliminating perceived enemies of the revolution, including former nobles, capitalists, and political opponents. The Whites, in turn, unleashed their own White Terror, targeting communists, Jews, who were often scapegoated, and anyone suspected of supporting the Reds. The sheer scale of violence and suffering during this period is almost unimaginable. Simultaneously with the Civil War, the newly formed Soviet state had to contend with the dire economic consequences of years of war and revolution. War communism was introduced, a drastic set of policies designed to ensure the survival of the Red Army and the industrial workforce. This involved the nationalization of all industries, strict labor discipline, and most controversially, the forced requisitioning of grain from the peasantry. While it helped the Red Army win the war, it led to widespread famine, particularly in 1921-1922, which claimed millions of lives. By late 1920, the main white armies had been defeated, and foreign intervention had largely ceased. The Bolsheviks had successfully defended their revolution, though at an immense cost. The Civil War left Russia utterly devastated. The economy was in ruins. Industrial and agricultural output had plummeted, and millions had died from combat, famine, and disease. Cities were depopulated, and much of the infrastructure was destroyed. The once vast Russian Empire, stripped of its old symbols and institutions, had been forged anew in the crucible of civil war, emerging as a Soviet state, a union of socialist republics. The Civil War was the final, bloody chapter in the demise of the old Russian Empire. It sealed the fate of the Romanovs, who had been executed in July 1918 by the Bolsheviks, removing any potential rallying point for the whites. It solidified the Bolsheviks' one-party rule and their reliance on coercion and terror as instruments of governance. The dream of a democratic Russia, briefly glimpsed after the February Revolution, was crushed in the brutal realities of civil conflict. The outcome of the Civil War profoundly shaped the future character of the Soviet Union, embedding within it a deep-seated suspicion of external enemies and internal dissent, and reliance on centralized control and military strength. The long, winding story of the Russian Empire, stretching back to the earliest Slavic tribes, now reached its definitive end, giving way to a new, entirely different, and equally complex political entity. Historians still argue whether the Red victory was inevitable given their strategic advantages, or if the white forces squandered their opportunities due to internal divisions and a failure to articulate a popular vision for Russia. The echoes of the Russian Civil War, a conflict that had utterly consumed the remnants of the old empire, finally began to fade in the early 1920s, leaving behind a landscape irrevocably altered. The dust settled not on a restored monarchy or a nascent democracy, but on a new revolutionary state, the Soviet Union. This final section, then, isn't about a grand finale, a triumphant climax, for the story of the Russian Empire had already met its end in the crucible of war and revolution. Instead, it's about the legacy it left behind, how its vastness and complexities, its triumphs and tragedies, quietly transformed into the foundations of something entirely new, yet undeniably shaped by its imperial past. The long, drawn-out balalaika melody, so characteristic of Russia's slow history, had dissolved into a different kind of silence, a quiet, almost melancholic hum of transformation. The formal end of the Russian Empire is often dated to the abdication of Nicholas II in February 1917, or perhaps more definitively to the Bolshevik October Revolution later that year. The execution of the Romanov imperial family in July 1918 by the Bolsheviks extinguished any lingering hopes of a monarchical restoration, ensuring that the old order was truly, completely gone. The vast lands that once comprised the empire were now bound together, not by a czar, but by a revolutionary ideology, and later by the iron will of the Communist Party. The immediate aftermath of the Civil War was a period of immense challenge for the new Soviet state. The economy was shattered, famine was widespread, and the population exhausted. The Bolsheviks, having won the war, now faced the daunting task of rebuilding a ruined country and establishing a new social and political order. This involved a radical shift from the war communism policies, which had sustained the Red Army but devastated the economy, to the new economic policy, NEP, a temporary retreat towards market-oriented reforms. Under NEP, peasants were allowed to sell their surplus grain, and small-scale private enterprise was permitted, bringing a much-needed breath of economic life back to the devastated land. It was a pragmatic step back from pure ideology, a realization that even revolutions need to eat. In December 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, was formally established, replacing the fragmented territories of the former Russian Empire with a federal union of nominally autonomous Soviet republics, while the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, RSFSR, remained the dominant entity. This new structure reflected the multi-ethnic nature of the former empire, at least in theory. In practice, power remained highly centralized in Moscow and within the Communist Party. The vastness of the former empire continued to be a defining characteristic of this new state, but its internal organization and external ambitions were fundamentally different. The legacy of the Russian Empire, however, did not simply vanish. Its historical trajectory, its geographical expanse, its cultural heritage, and its deeply ingrained social structures profoundly influenced the development of the Soviet Union. The tradition of autocracy and centralization, forged over centuries by figures like Ivan the Great and Peter the Great, found a new, even more absolute expression in the one-party rule of the Communist Party and the cult of personality that would later surround its leaders, particularly Joseph Stalin. The notion of a strong state, capable of directing society and economy from above, was a direct inheritance from the imperial past. The desire for strong leadership, often expressed with a quiet, almost whispered longing, remained a powerful undercurrent. The vastness of the former imperial territories, particularly the resource-rich lands of Siberia and Central Asia, continued to be vital for the Soviet economy and its strategic depth. The multi-ethnic composition of the empire, a result of centuries of conquest and expansion, also became a defining feature of the Soviet Union, albeit one managed under a different ideological framework that alternately promoted and suppressed national identities. The complex relationship with the West, oscillating between cautious engagement and deep suspicion, also carried echoes of the imperial past. The story of the Russian Empire, in its grand sweeping narrative, is one of continuous expansion, of a slow but relentless gathering of lands and peoples around a central core. From the earliest Slavic tribes forming rudimentary communities through the rise of Kievan Rus, the trauma of the Mongol Yoke, the patient ascent of Moscow, and the forceful transformations under the czars like Peter and Catherine, the empire steadily grew, often through immense struggle and sacrifice. It was a story of a people shaped by the vastness of their land, by harsh winters, and by the relentless pursuit of security and power. And so, as the sound of the balalaika faded and the final echoes of the empire's long story settled into the landscape, the curtain fell on one act of Russian history and rose on another. The old order, with its gilded palaces and ancient rituals, had finally definitively passed into legend. The people, the rivers, the vast forests and steppes remained, but the name on the map had changed, and with it, the guiding philosophy of the nation. Yet the deep currents of history, the patterns of governance, and the very spirit of the land would continue to whisper through the ages, a testament to an empire that may have ended, but whose influence resonated for generations, shaping what was to come. And so, the story of the Russian Empire, in its sweeping, often sorrowful, and ultimately transformative arc, sank into the quiet realm of history, a tale to be pondered as you drift into dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.